Committee come to order. Before we start, I wanted to notice to every member that you'll find in your desk drawer, in addition to a seating chart of the members of the committee, a chart of all the staff on both sides of the aisle. It's just been one of those things that's always driven me nuts over the last 20 years, is not knowing who all these people are that work for us and keeping up with them as they change. So that'll be in your desk drawer. Without objection, the chair may declare the hearing in recess at any point, so ordered. A few housekeeping matters before we begin. First, we will adjourn the public portion of this hearing at 12:30 today and immediately move upstairs for the classified portion. Second, I want to welcome back to the committee Mr. Vesey after his brief hiatus. Glad that you remembered where we were. And finally, after consultation with the minority, I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Clyde of Georgia, a member of the Appropriations Committee, be allowed to question witnesses in today's hearing without objection, so ordered. Last Friday, we observed the one-year anniversary of Putin's illegal and brutal invasion of Ukraine. The American people have responded with extraordinary support for the Ukrainians. Millions of Americans have donated their time and money to charitable organizations helping the Ukrainian people. Some have even volunteered to fight alongside the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Congress has responded by appropriating over $100 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and our NATO allies. To date, the administration has distributed over $75 billion of that money, including $46 billion in security assistance. These are unprecedented numbers, and it requires an unprecedented level of oversight by this committee and by Congress. We're up to the task. Last year, Chairman Smith started monthly classified briefings with the administration officials that have continued into the new majority. Many of us have traveled to Ukraine and surrounding countries to witness firsthand the train and equip mission. We've made classified information on the situation in Ukraine available to all members, and our staff have constantly been being briefed with the latest developments by the department. But today is the first time the committee of the House is holding an open public hearing on the matter. I've asked the Inspector General and the Undersecretary to appear today because it is imperative that the American people understand, A, where our security system is going, B, how it's being used, C, and what protections are in place to ensure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. But oversight is about more than just accounting. It's about ensuring the administration is setting strategic goals and implementing a policy to achieve them. That's why we all are here with very real concerns. Since the beginning, the President has been overly worried, in my view, that giving Ukraine what it needs to win would be too escalatory. This hesitation has only prolonged the war and driven up the cost in terms of dollars and lives. This conflict must end, and the President must be willing to do what it takes to end it with victory. Continued reluctance and indecision only empowers Putin, and it sends the wrong signals to President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party. And with that, I yield to my friend and colleague, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I welcome our witnesses as well, and really thank you for the work you've done. You've all appeared before us in classified settings to update us on a very regular basis on the effort in Ukraine. We appreciate the cooperative relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch on this matter. And more than anything, we appreciate your leadership in supporting Ukraine so effectively over the course of the last year. I think it's hard to really imagine the massive undertaking that has been done in the last year since Russia made its decision to invade, and really since in the weeks and to some degree months before the invasion, when we came to realize from our intelligence community that this was going to happen. First of all, we were about the only country in the world that thought it was going to happen. Even the Ukrainians themselves, right up literally to the day of the invasion, thought that we were exaggerating the intelligence and that this wasn't actually going to happen. So from pretty much a dead stop, the Biden administration had to pull together a massive coalition to do something that almost all of the countries involved in that coalition had never contemplated doing and certainly had hoped they would never have to do. And we've done that with a remarkable outcome. the way that coalition was pulled together and the forces that have been given and the weapons that have been given to Ukraine to enable them to be as successful as they have been, combined, of course, with their unbelievable courage and tenacity, is really a remarkable accomplishment. And I think we need to understand it in that perspective. Obviously, we would like the Ukraine to win tomorrow, Russia to be completely pushed out. But I think we also have to be realistic about the challenge that we faced and how we've gone about meeting that challenge, and really how effective we've been in doing that. Now, the purpose of this hearing specifically is on oversight. I think we have had a lot of oversight on this effort from the very beginning. And that is part of the reason why the effort has been so successful. There are constant efforts to sort of spin stories, primarily coming from Russian propaganda, about corruption and weapon systems going where they're not supposed to be. But people who have looked at this, and I know the chairman has done this in great detail, have found that there is no instance of that happening. We have seen the effectiveness. And the best evidence of this, clearly and unequivocally, is the fact that the Ukrainians have been as successful on the battlefield as they have been. If the weapons and equipment and support that we were sending them was being sent elsewhere or stolen or misused, they would have lost a long time ago. Because I think one of the other things that we forget here is even us in the U.S., we saw the war coming, we supported Ukraine, but even us, along with everybody else, thought the Ukrainians didn't stand a chance. We thought that the Russians would be in Kyiv in a week or two, a month at the most. So the fact that they've been as successful as they have been is the best evidence we have that these systems and support that we're sending them is being as well used as it possibly can. And I do want to touch upon the point that the chairman made about how the administration hasn't been quick enough. You know, one of the things that we've heard, not just from critics of the war who don't want to support it, but even from people who do support it, is that there can't be a blank check. That's been sort of the criticism that you take if you want to sort of make it sound like you're still with Ukraine, but you want to be responsible. And I think that's appropriate, okay? But no blank check means no blank check. It means we don't just send everything that people ask for in the blink of an eye without even thinking about it, okay? We think about it and we get the Ukrainians what they really need. And I'm going to go ahead and hit upon one of those examples because I think this is a really good example of the problem, and that is the F-16, which everyone has become obsessed over here in recent weeks. We have considered that request, and I've had many conversations with the witnesses before us and with the DOD as well. And the honest truth is the cost of trying to get the F-16 up and ready to operate in Ukraine, even if we basically said there's nothing more important than that one weapon system and spent all of our time and all of our resources on doing it, best case scenario, we could maybe get some operational F-16s into Ukraine within a year, maybe 8 months if we really pushed it. And this is getting lucky, all right? Because you don't just have to train the pilots. You have to train the mechanics. You have to have airfields that can accommodate the F-16. And you have to have the spare parts to make it work. So we looked at that and we determined that is not a wise use of the resources that are necessary to win the fight. That's what no blank check means. You don't just send it without thinking about it. We thought about it and reached a very intelligent conclusion that this is not the right system. And oh, by the way, a fourth-generation fighter in this particular fight is going to struggle to survive. There are isolated circumstances where the Ukrainians have been able to use the MiG-29s that they have, very isolated, because it's a fourth-generation fighter in the face of a ton of air defense. What we are getting the Ukrainians is those air defense systems that they desperately need to survive right now, and the artillery and the HIMARS and the weapon systems that they do need. So the administration is doing exactly what it needs to do, getting equipment as quickly and as responsibly as possible to make this work. And I also want to make everybody aware of the fact the Russians are fighting a massive information campaign. Yes, they're fighting on the battlefield, and I'll look forward to hearing more details about that today, but they are also trying to break the coalition. You know, the Russian military has performed incredibly poorly. The Ukrainians have performed incredibly heroically, and the war is not going the way that Putin wanted it to, but he is not giving up. And he knows his only hope is to break the coalition that is trying to support Ukraine. And they're trying to do that in a variety of different ways. I mean, you can see all the different arguments about how, well, NATO really started this because of NATO expansion and a whole lot of other nonsense arguments that are circulating out there. But the other part of the way they're doing it is any break in the coalition they see, they're poking and they're prodding. okay? They want to undermine the Biden administration. So while we have constructive criticism of what's going on, let's make sure that that criticism is constructive and we maintain our unity. And I know it is very, very difficult for the folks on the other side of the aisle to say anything positive about the Biden administration. But part of holding this coalition together is to acknowledge the incredible job that has been done in the last year and to maintain that unity and to not jump at every shiny object that seems to be criticism of the Biden administration, like the F-16. Right now, and I've asked this question, we are getting every single weapon system that we can to Ukraine. There is not a decision being made about that might be escalatory. It's about what can we get to them? How can we maintain the support? We've spent a lot of money. There is not a limitless amount of money or a limitless amount of equipment. So I think those decisions are being made wisely. I look forward to this hearing. I think it's perfectly appropriate that we have aggressive oversight as we've had since the beginning. And that's part of the reason why we've been as successful to date as we have been. With that, I yield back. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
I thank the ranking member. I now want to introduce our witnesses. The Honorable Colin Call is the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Dr. Call has been the primary official overseeing the DOD's response to Ukraine. The Honorable Dr. Robert Storch is the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. Together with the IGs of the State Department and USAID, his office is carrying out audits and investigations of the assistance we are providing to Ukraine. And Lieutenant General Doug Sims is the Director of Operations for the Joint Staff. He assists the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs in developing and providing operational guidance on Ukraine and other military operations. I welcome the witnesses. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your preparation. I know this takes a lot of effort to get ready for these hearings, and it is appreciated and helpful. Dr. Call, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, it's a real honor to appear before you today alongside my good friend, Lieutenant General D.A. Sims over there, and Dr. Storch, our department's Inspector General. I want to begin by expressing the unwavering support of the Department of Defense for Ukraine's sovereignty and security in the face of Russia's unprovoked and brutal invasion. I know that support is shared by and is enabled by Congress and the American people. So I want to thank you for your crucial and continued help to get Ukraine the military capabilities and other types of assistance that it needs to remain in the fight. Thank you, too, for holding this important hearing at this pivotal time for the security of Ukraine, of Europe, and of the world. As we mark 1 year since Russia's further invasion of Ukraine, it's clear that Russia has failed to achieve any of its objectives. Its military is paying tremendous costs. Ukraine remains united and determined to expel Russia's invading forces from its territory, and NATO unity is stronger now than it has been in decades. We are seeing intense fighting in eastern Ukraine as Russia seeks points to exploit and Ukraine defends tenaciously. What happens in the coming months may prove decisive, and we are focused on providing Ukraine with the capabilities it needs right now to defend its people and its territory and change the dynamics on the front lines. I'd like to take a few minutes to lay out our priority capabilities, the ones we're providing to Ukraine now and in the coming days, weeks, and months. First, we have focused on a layered, integrated approach to air defense to counter Russia's attacks on population centers and civilian infrastructure. The Patriot capability from the United States, as well as that provided by Germany and the Netherlands, will give Ukraine advanced long-range capability. These are complemented by medium and short-range capabilities provided by the United States, as well as our allies and partners. Second, we continue to work with allies and partners to deliver a steady flow of artillery rounds and other ammunition so Ukraine can sustain its fight. Third, to enhance Ukraine's ability to maneuver, the United States will provide Abrams main battle tanks, the best tanks in the world. The UK has also committed Challenger tanks, and other European states will provide Leopard tanks. These main battle tanks are complemented by other vital armor capabilities from the United States, including Bradleys and Stryker fighting vehicles, and other fighting vehicles from our European partners. Finally, we have expanded U.S.-led collective training to enable the Ukrainians to better integrate fires and maneuver. Our assistance to Ukraine is possible thanks to the tremendous bipartisan support from Congress. As you know, we have now provided $31.7 billion in support since Russia launched its further invasion of Ukraine a year ago, and our allies and partners have now provided over $19 billion in addition to what we've done. The Department of Defense appreciates the most recent additional Supplemental Appropriations Act, which provided presidential drawdown authority, funding for the military services to replace items sent to Ukraine, and funding for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, or USAI. Even as we focus on getting Ukraine what it needs, we've always prioritized accountability, and Ukraine has too. We have adapted our accountability practices for the combat environment to address the risk of illicit diversion, using mechanisms that go above and beyond our standard practices. 1 year ago, Russia launched its brutal invasion to destroy Ukraine as a free and sovereign nation, threatening European security, transatlantic unity, and the security of the world. Today, an independent, sovereign, democratic Ukraine endures. The incredible people in the armed forces of Ukraine remain unbowed and unbroken, and NATO and the wider community of democracies around the world is stronger than ever. The stakes for our national security remain significant. We are determined to support Ukraine's fight against tyranny and oppression, and in doing so to defend the American interests and values that are so clearly at stake. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Call. I'd like to recognize General Sims now for 5 minutes to summarize his statement.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I appreciate today's opportunity to update you on the U.S. military efforts to help the Ukrainian people in their continued fight against the Russian invasion. Today marks the 369th day since Russian forces invaded and began their illegal and unprovoked large-scale invasion of Ukraine. As we meet today, the current situation between Ukraine and Russia is generally static, with both sides employing heavy amounts of artillery, resulting in minimal changes of territory and significant numbers of casualties. In our follow-on session, I'm prepared to discuss particulars of Ukrainian disposition, but generally, and as you've seen reported in open sources, the most active portion of the battlefield today is around the town of Bakhmut. As I have briefed before, over the past 2 months, the Russian army, with assistance of private military contractor Wagner Group, has fought savagely to defeat Ukraine's defenses, employing extreme amounts of artillery and waves of thousands of partially trained, mobilized soldiers and personnel contracted from prisons. The Russians have made incremental gains at significant cost. Ultimately, as I have described before, the fighting has replicated the conditions of the First World War. Key to changing this paradigm is creating a Ukrainian armed forces capable of breaking this state of fighting. In this regard, since I last updated this committee, the concentration of U.S. effort has been focused on combining equipment and munitions with people and training. The intent and efforts of the U.S. military are designed to generate combat-credible forces capable of combining fire and movement to achieve maneuver and increase the overall capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. Importantly, this training effort is not solely the work of the U.S. armed forces, but is a cohesive approach with our allies and partners. Collective training is ongoing throughout Europe and is dramatically increasing Ukrainian combined arms organizations. All told, since January, the U.S. military has trained another 1,000 Ukrainians, bringing the total trained by the United States to just over 4,000. As I speak, Ukrainians are training in multiple locations in Europe, working with U.S. service members and military trainers from our allies and partners. Key to our ability to conduct collaborative training has been the recent increase in maneuver-related equipment. The U.S. provision of Bradley fighting vehicles, Strykers, and Paladin howitzers, combined with similar fighting vehicles and tank contributions from our partners, is notably increasing the capability of the Ukrainian armed forces. In addition, the U.S. continues to supply critical munitions and individual equipment, from howitzers, howitzer ammunition to medical and cold weather gear. Finally, and critically important to Ukraine's ability to continue to defeat Russian efforts to destroy civilian infrastructure, U.S. armed forces will soon complete the training and equipping of Ukraine's first Patriot battery. As you know, our air defense experts are providing key training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. We are confident the Ukrainians will employ Patriots with the same expertise they are demonstrating every day with their current air defense capabilities. Thank you for what this committee and this Congress have done and continue to do to provide oversight and resources in support of Ukraine as they continue to fight against the illegal and unprovoked large-scale invasion. While the Ukrainians bear the real burdens of this war, your support and that of the American people has had a profound impact on Ukraine's future. I look forward to your questions and discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Mr. Dortch, you're recognized.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to appear today to discuss the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General's comprehensive independent oversight of U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, as well as our active participation in a whole-of-government approach to ensuring robust oversight of the full range of American assistance. During the year following the 2022 Russian invasion, the DoD OIG completed 4 Ukraine-related oversight projects, with a 5th report released just yesterday. We currently have some 20 ongoing and planned audits and evaluations that are focused on, among other things, ensuring that tax dollars are used properly, that there's appropriate accountability for weapons and other material, and that U.S. stocks are appropriately replenished so they're available should they be needed elsewhere. Additionally, the DoD OIG's Defense Criminal Investigative Service is actively engaged in conducting fraud prevention and investigative activities that play a critical role in ensuring the integrity of U.S. assistance to Ukraine. The DoD OIG currently has more than 90 professionals engaged in oversight of security assistance to Ukraine. In 2022, we issued 2 management advisories that identified several areas of concern that could directly impact the DoD's ability to transparently track and report the supplemental appropriations for Ukraine. Earlier this year, we initiated an audit examining DoD's execution of funds appropriated to assist Ukraine. We have long been focused on end-use monitoring, known as EUM, and enhanced end-use monitoring, or EEUM, the DoD's tracking of how our country's partners employ military assistance and sensitive equipment after those assets are transferred to them. As early as 2020, we issued a report on how the DoD was conducting EEUM of military assistance to Ukraine. In October 2022, we published a classified report that identified challenges DoD personnel responsible for EUM and EEUM face when there are limited or no U.S. personnel present, and the actions the DoD was taking to address those issues in Ukraine. As the situation on the ground has continued to evolve, we recently initiated our 3rd evaluation on EEUM in Ukraine, and we will continue to focus on this important area. Yesterday, we publicly released our most recent report related to the Ukraine effort, making recommendations to assist the Army with its maintenance, inventory, and other processes for pre-positioned equipment in the region. In addition to the topics above, our ongoing and planned projects cover the waterfront of American security assistance to Ukraine, addressing critical issues like the replenishment of U.S. stocks, intelligence sharing, security control for the transport of weapons and equipment, their maintenance and sustainment, awards of non-competitive contracts, and the training of Ukrainian armed forces. And, as noted at the outset, DCIS agents are drawing on their experience around the world to conduct outreach and investigations to help prevent and address fraud or other criminal conduct. We are not conducting this oversight alone. We are partnering closely with the Department of State OIG and the U.S. Agency for International Development OIG and many others across the oversight community in a coordinated approach to ensure comprehensive oversight of all U.S. assistance to Ukraine. Along with our oversight partners, the DoD OIG established and leads the Ukraine Oversight Interagency Working Group, which brings together 20 oversight entities in a whole-of-government approach. Just last month, my office and the state and USAID OIGs, in coordination with the larger working group, published our Joint Strategic Oversight Plan, which publicly describes our completed and ongoing work. As detailed in the plan, we are employing the proven model that has been used for years to ensure comprehensive oversight of overseas contingency operations, and we will work together in this effort for as long as the conflict and the need for oversight continue. At the end of January, I traveled with the leaders of the state and USAID OIGs to Germany, Poland, and into Ukraine in order to obtain the latest on-the-ground perspective, to build on our coordinated approach, and to deliver an unambiguous message to American and, in Kyiv, high-level Ukrainian officials about the expectations for accountability for U.S. assistance. The trip made clear that the situation is fluid and calls for continuous, agile oversight. The DoD OIG, working hand in glove with our oversight partners, will continue to make independent oversight of assistance to Ukraine a matter of the highest priority, and we will continue to keep the Congress and the public informed about our work. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Storch. Before we move into questions, I wanted to remind everybody that the maps that you have in front of you, while they're unclassified, we haven't been given permission by the department yet to distribute them beyond the committee, so I'd ask you to leave those here when you leave. And I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Call, if Russia were to be successful in taking control of Ukraine, what would that portend for a potential of China taking an effort at Taiwan?
Well, Mr. Chairman, we've seen what a world looks like when revisionist authoritarian powers go on the march and they're unchecked by the free world and they carve out spheres of influence by gobbling up their neighbors. That world was the 1930s, and it culminated in the worst human tragedy in history, the Second World War.
So it enhanced the likelihood that could happen.
I think if Russia is successful in Ukraine or is seen as successful in Ukraine, it will embolden other aggressors elsewhere to do similar things.
That's my point. Chair now yields the balance of his time to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde.
I thank Chairman Rogers for his invitation to be here today and for yielding me his time to discuss this important matter of oversight of U.S. military support to Ukraine. As we all know, the United States has authorized over $100 billion in aid, to which our government holds a responsibility to the American people, that it be used for its true, just, and intended purpose. It is the responsibility of Congress to ensure that every single penny of American taxpayer money is being effectively used as intended to assist the Ukrainian people in their fight against Russian aggression. Just 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of joining the chairman to visit several of our NATO allies in Europe to receive an update on the war effort in Ukraine and the ongoing oversight work directly related to U.S. military aid. Accountability of the weapons shipped in is absolutely paramount, especially the most sensitive weapons, to ensure that they are being used for their intended purpose and not diverted for nefarious purpose. As a supply officer with both multiple peacetime deployments and multiple combat deployments in my 28 years of Navy service, I am fully aware of the challenges of maintaining visibility and control of critical military hardware and components when the supply lines are long and the theater is kinetic. So, Mr. Storch, I would like to start with you as a Department of Defense Inspector General. In all your inspections and oversight, in country and out, have you found any instances of sensitive weapons like Stinger missiles being either lost or diverted to those not authorized to have them?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm obviously not at liberty to talk about any investigations, but we have not substantiated any such instances, no, sir.
So you can confidently say that to your knowledge, every sensitive weapon is currently under control of those who should have them.
Well, thank you very much for the question. That's why we're engaged we're laser focused on this issue and engaged in robust oversight to make sure that's the case. We're doing audits and evaluations that look at the weapons from the time they begin at the port while they're transferred throughout as they get to the transshipment points and then they go into the country. And then, as I mentioned in my statement, we're now conducting our third evaluation of the EUM, and with regard to the sensitive assets, the EEUM, the enhanced monitoring, to ensure that the Department of Defense is conducting that monitoring in a robust way. Additionally, as I mentioned, we have the DCIS, the Defense Criminal Investigation Service. They have vast experience all over the world in doing investigations arising out of conflict situations. And so, again, we're very much alert to any instances where that sort of conduct would occur.
Okay. All right, moving on. As I understand it, your office is currently working on, among other things, an audit of DoD award and administration of non-competitively awarded contracts in support of Ukraine. Has there been any waste, fraud, or abuse uncovered or reported to your office in these investigations?
So I appreciate the question. I want to be careful and not get out ahead of my skis because the audit is ongoing.
Okay.
So we are looking at those issues in our audit, and we'll report out on what we find. But the purpose of the audit is to ensure that the DoD has the controls in place to make sure that doesn't happen.
According to your testimony, you said that there were some posters, both in Ukrainian and English, the language, sent out about a particular hotline that people could call if they wanted to report something. So without compromising any identities, have any whistleblowers come forward with information using that particular method of reporting, to your knowledge?
So thank you for referencing the hotline. It's something we worked closely on with our partners
I read
from
your
state and
testimony.
USAID. And the goal is to provide an avenue for people to report what they think may be wrong. We have gotten all sorts of types of allegations over that, and we're continuing to look at them.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, for the record, I would like to submit an article from USA Today, and it says, U.S. has spent billions in Ukraine war aid, but is that money landing in corrupt pockets? It was updated as of yesterday, February the 27th.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
I think the gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you
Chair
very much.
now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kroll, I want to follow up a little bit on what Chairman Rogers was asking about in terms of the policy behind this. As the Undersecretary for Policy, you seem like the appropriate person to ask that question to. This policy is not without risk. I think we all know that. First of all, it is costing an enormous amount of money in terms of tens of billions of dollars. We are also acutely aware of the fact that we do not want to get into a direct conflict with Russia, and we don't want NATO to get into a direct conflict with Russia. But can you state for us clearly why you still believe this is the correct policy to support Ukraine in this war, what the implications are for our own national security? Because I think it's a legitimate question, the American taxpayer, why are we spending money? It seems like a long way away, and not to be overly crass about it, but a lot of constituents ask the question, what's all this got to do with me? I think the policy is sound, but I want to give you the opportunity to say, here's why this matters to U.S. national security.
Well, thank you. Look, I think the entire international system is grounded on the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's at the heart of the UN, and that may sound kind of wonky, except that the entire rules-based order that undergirds is what ultimately minimizes the number of international conflicts and wars that we see. If countries like Russia are allowed to go on the march to swallow up their neighbors, if might makes right, if the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must, then the rule of law will be replaced with the rule of the jungle. And we will live in a very dangerous world. And I'll just give you one example. If you're sitting in Tehran or in Pyongyang or in Beijing, and you're contemplating aggression against a neighbor, and in all those circumstances that's conceivable, you're going to ask yourself, what would be the reaction of the international community? And had the international community stood by, had the United States not exercised its leadership to rally not only the democracies in Europe and North America, but countries around the world to Ukraine's aid, the lesson that dictators in other countries would take is that aggression won't be punished, and that it pays. And that would make the world a much more dangerous place for Americans.
I think it's very well stated. And I think one other argument to make in this is a lot of people who are concerned about this point to our policy in Iraq. And certainly there were a ton of mistakes made there. But the thing that a lot of people forget is on your point of sovereignty, what kicked that whole thing out was Saddam Hussein trying to take over Kuwait and then setting his eyes on Saudi Arabia. Now, how we handled that is highly debatable. In terms of the long term, both what we did in '91, what we did in 2003, but the principle of sovereignty and the principle of exactly what you just stated, not allowing a country like Russia or China to think that they can simply grab territory by force, is core to our own security and to the security of the world long term. And as we speak, we are very aware of the Taiwan situation with China. But China, and I haven't added up the number of countries, but it's more than a half dozen, have sovereign territory now that China, to one degree or another, claims. And if just like Russia says that Ukraine shouldn't exist, they should be part of Russia, China has the same argument in land that's currently controlled by Vietnam, by the Philippines, by Japan, by India, all across the world. It kicks off a very, very dangerous situation if President Putin is successful in Ukraine. And I think we need to remember that, even while we are aware of the cost and while we're aware of the necessity of making sure that we check where this money is going, which, as Mr. Storch outlined, I think we're doing. But the policy itself is really crucial to peace and stability in the world and ultimately to our own national security in the United States. None of that makes it easy. We all want peace in Ukraine as quickly as possible. But right now, as has been stated clearly, that the path to peace in Ukraine is simple. Putin can stop his war and take his troops out of sovereign Ukraine, and that stops the war in the blink of an eye. But until that happens, we have to support Ukraine to force Putin to that choice. So I appreciate you articulating that, and I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mike Rogers and Ranking Member Adam Smith, for this very important bipartisan hearing on the issues of Ukraine and immediately the effect that it has on the Chinese Communist Party. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I believe the world is in a global competition between democracies with rule of law opposed by authoritarians with rule of gun. Today's conflict is war criminal Putin's mass murder in Ukraine. This, I believe, if Ukraine must be victorious to deter the Chinese Communist Party from attacking the 24 million people of Taiwan, Ukraine must be victorious to stop Iran from its efforts to vaporize Israel as it develops intercontinental ballistic missiles to devastate American families. With that, Mr. Sorge, there have been billions in U.S. weaponry and financial aid flowing to Ukraine and more coming to stop a war criminal Putin. We're all concerned about accountability, and the American people need to know, because somehow this hadn't been recognized, and that is that in all of the legislation that's passed to provide for funding, there have been 39 provisions that provide for reports to be provided to Congress on oversight and accountability. And with that, what is the DOD Inspector General's plan, and what are the broader coordination with the State Department IG, USAID IG, and other relevant IGs? What's the structure to protect the American taxpayer?
Thank you very much for the question. We are actively engaged on an ongoing basis with the state OIG, the USAID OIG, and all of our partners in the working group in ensuring comprehensive oversight over all aspects of assistance to Ukraine. Obviously, my office, the DoD OIG, has primary responsibility with regard to the security assistance, and we have, as we speak, approximately 20 ongoing and planned audits and evaluations that cover every aspect of that security assistance, including the broad range that I mentioned in my statement. We're also working with our partners to make sure that there aren't any gaps with regard to the different types of assistance that are being provided. We're reporting out transparently. We did the Joint Strategic Oversight Plan that I mentioned, and we're going to continue to report out. We have a report coming at the beginning of April under the NDAA. That will be providing an update on our work, and we're going to continue to update the JSOP and our other work so this Congress and the American public are fully informed regarding our oversight efforts. It's on us to ensure that there's appropriate oversight across the board to ensure that taxpayer dollars are being spent appropriately and the equipment is being used as intended.
And thank you so much for what you do, but please let's get this publicized so American people can trust what the expenditures are. Dr. Call, I'm really concerned about foreign military sales, delivery to Ukraine, delivery to Taiwan. And our allies are making the best of their ability to provide. And then, for example, we're providing 31 Abrams tanks. Somehow the media presented that we would not have any tanks in the future. They leave out that we have 8,000 tanks, Abrams tanks. We potentially have 22,000, actually, Abrams tanks. But the 31 was presented as just debilitating the United States. We can do better. And so what's being done, particularly working with Chairman Mike Rogers and others, to have an expedited foreign military sales, it's absurd with prepositioning of equipment when we hear that it may take a year to get equipment to Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Congressman. As you know, we predominantly use two sets of authorities at DoD to get Ukraine weapons. PDA, Presidential Drawdown, which allows us to draw from stocks, and then USAI, which allows us to put things on contract. When we draw things out of stocks, things generally arrive in Ukraine within days or a handful of weeks. When we put things on contract, it depends. Sometimes it's weeks, sometimes it's a handful of months, sometimes it is longer than that. So it really depends on which authority we are using, but we have surged a tremendous amount of security assistance into Ukraine. More than $31.7 billion in a year. I don't know that there's any historical precedent for that. The vast majority of that has come out of our stocks and has come very rapidly. I'll just say I share your frustration with the broader foreign military sales process. We are getting after that problem through a Tiger team at the Department of Defense that has identified, I think, about 80 process improvements that can streamline these things. It's still too slow. And all I would say is that there's nothing, as we draw things down from our stocks, that is making the FMS problem worse. It's kind of an apples and oranges issue because FMS is more aligned with the USAI authority in terms of putting things on contract.
We need to follow the example of the Czech Republic and then last week Poland, providing equipment immediately. Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, now recognize gentleman, Mr. Courtney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to begin by recognizing both your efforts and Ranking Member Smith's efforts to hold recurring updates and briefings by this committee. And in my opinion, it has been that healthy process which has provided the foundation for the bipartisan votes that have passed supplemental funding really over the last year. And again, the witnesses have been part of that process, so thank you for your contribution. Just to, foot stomp what I think my friend Mr. Wilson just indicated is that included in those supplemental funding bills were actually specific explicit language by Congress directed towards the offices of Inspector General to be engaged at the maximum level. And again, Mr. Storch, if you could just sort of confirm that for the record, that, again, you've been around for a long time, thank goodness, but again, it also has been with congressional support that your efforts are taking place.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the question. We very much appreciate that support, and we're committed to the greatest possible transparency in our oversight efforts.
So, and again, when we talk about a blank check, I mean, I think clearly we in the Congress had our eyes wide open when these large amounts of funding were authorized and appropriated, that we wanted oversight at every step of the way. In dealing with, again, Ukraine's efforts to deal with waste, fraud, and abuse, Dr. Call, there's an international organization which kind of keeps score on countries' efforts in terms of dealing with corruption and fraud, and it's Transparency International. In the last year, at the same time that this unprecedented almost infusion of money has been flowing in, not just from the U.S., but also from the EU, Ukraine's position on Transparency International's ranking actually improved. It was one of the few countries in the world. It went up 6 places. And I wonder if you could just sort of, with that backdrop, talk about your perspective as far as the seriousness with which the Ukrainian government has approached this whole question of making sure that this help goes to the right place.
Thank you. I've worked the Ukraine issue now for about 9 years, and in our engagements over that entire period, corruption was the #1 issue we raised with Ukrainian officials. And I think there have been improvements over time, especially in the defense sector, which is obviously most germane for DOD. I will just tell you, in our engagements with senior Ukrainian officials now, I was in Kyiv in January, the secretary talks to his counterpart about every other week. The importance of accountability, of transparency, and of combating corruption are always points of emphasis for us. But it's not just what our talking points say. We have to put, our effort into it. We've provided the Ukrainians with ways to track the systems we provide, to include scanners and software. We've done, when it's safe, remote visits to sites. We don't see any evidence of diversion in our reporting. We think the Ukrainians are using properly what they've been given. But we'll continue to foot stomp the importance of accountability and transparency for all the reasons you mentioned.
And looking again at President Zelensky's own efforts, I would say he courageously took steps to remove officials, some very close even to his office, and political supporters of his own, which shows, I think, tremendous commitment to not just talking about trying to address this problem, but actually taking action to remove people, which again, I think just sort of demonstrates, true commitment. I think, that should be also acknowledged in terms of the seriousness with which, he and his administration is pursuing this goal. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to, as long as we're entering newspaper articles, I'd like to ask that the piece in this morning's Washington Post, Zelensky takes on Ukraine's top internal enemy, be admitted to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And again, that walks through the whole question of how they've improved their score with Transparency International in the midst of, dealing with an existential threat to their country. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Connecticut. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing, and thank you all for being here today. General Sims, I'd like to ask you the first question I have. Last week, Vladimir Putin announced the suspension of Russia's participation in the New START treaty. This followed an earlier declaration by the U.S. State Department that Russia was violating the New START treaty. So it appears that Russia has taken New START hostage and is using it to try to get us to stop funding Ukraine. Is the Joint Staff developing plans and options should Russia further violate its limitations in New START? For instance, if it starts uploading its nuclear delivery systems above the caps?
Sure, thank you for the question. So I'll save some fine-tuning on that question for our follow-on session, if that's okay, and certainly pass any of the policy implications to Dr. Call to answer. But I would simply say we continue to maintain the strongest nuclear force in the world. We continue to monitor the nuclear situation around the world, to include Russia. And if I was an American, I would not be worried about the nuclear situation.
Very good. And Dr. Call, if you could follow up on that, what are some of the diplomatic or other things that the administration is doing in response to Russia's latest stance on New START?
Thanks. It's a really important question. Look, I think as a practical matter, the suspension doesn't make a lot of difference for the reason you mentioned, which is that they were already out of compliance with the inspections regime using COVID and other things as excuses. It's also interesting that Putin decided to suspend as opposed to leave the treaty. And I think that's actually an indication that it's not effective leverage over us. It won't be effective leverage over the Biden administration. Yes, we believe arms control and strategic stability matter for the safety of the American people and for the world. But frankly, Russia is in no position for an unconstrained nuclear arms race. They do not have the money, especially given the strain on their military from the war, sanctions, export controls. So, I think this was a way for him to generate some rhetorical headlines, but I think as a practical matter, it has not changed the situation. Russia remains a dangerous power with a lot of nuclear weapons, and we have to be vigilant against that danger.
Okay, thank you. And I do think it was a mistake for President Biden to re-up New START when he first took office without any discussions at all with the Russians. I think we could have perhaps gotten some concessions or some further understanding, so I think that was a mistake. However, I will compliment the President, and the ranking member will be glad to hear this. I think it was right for him to go to Ukraine recently, and I think that sent the right signal. We all hope and pray to God that there is no use of nuclear weapons by Russia in Ukraine, tactical or anything else. And we don't want to give away what our response would be should that happen, and a lot would depend on the specific circumstances, but what would be some of the consequences to Russia should that unthinkable thing happen?
Thank you for that, and I'm happy to talk about this in greater detail in the classified setting, but what I'll say here is the following. We've made it very clear to Russian leadership at the highest levels through intelligence channels, my boss, Secretary Austin, to his Russian counterpart, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to Gerasimov, our National Security Advisor, to his counterpart in the Kremlin, that any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine on any scale would be considered a world-changing event that would bring about severe consequences far in excess to anything the Russians have experienced to date, and that a lot of the restraints we've been operating under would no longer obtain in a world where Russia crossed that threshold. But the good news is I don't think they're likely to do so.
Yeah, and what they have to lose would be far more than what they would have to gain. And lastly, General Sims, Russia has made some, I think, exaggerated claims that it has used hypersonic weapons in Ukraine, just as they exaggerate a lot of things about their capabilities. Can you shed any further light on that particular question?
Sir, we know they've employed advanced conventional munitions. I wouldn't go into detail here in this session on the particulars. I would tell you that they're doing so at great expense. They're finding now that their weapons of all types are in dire straits in many cases. And I think what they're also seeing is that the Ukrainians have been very prepared for many of their weapons and are shooting down their weapons at a very high rate.
Very good. Thank you again for being here, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the work that you're personally doing in reaching out and trying to make sure that the supplies are getting to where they need to go, particularly the journey that you took 2 weeks ago to Greece, Romania, and Poland. My question first goes to you, Mr. Stork. Thank you for your detailed explanation of the various projects that you have underway, you and your colleagues have underway. I'd like you to very briefly, or as whatever necessary, summarize the reports that you have provided over the last year and a half. There seems to be two different pieces to that, one of which you have already talked to, and that is suggested improvements in the auditing, in the transfer of weapons and the like. And if you'd like to go into that a little more. And secondly, if you would summarize the findings of those reports, following up on the question earlier about what you actually found.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the question. As you say, the reports that we've issued to date over the past year since the 2022 invasion really have fallen largely into two categories. A couple of them have looked at issues that we identified relating to the way in which the money that was appropriated is being tracked and the way in which it is being entered into the systems. And so the concerns there are that if there aren't additional improvements, that those could result in a lack of transparency or impair the transparency of those funds. So the department has been making progress in those areas. We've continued to look at that. And as I mentioned, we've recently initiated an audit that's looking at the actual execution of the funds appropriated. So that's sort of an ongoing priority, is how's the money being spent. We did identify issues with the systems and with the procedures in place, made recommendations to help to address.
Let's be clear then, is the department following on your recommendations and making progress to achieve the goals that you've stated?
So, yes, sir. The first management advisory didn't actually have specific recommendations. It raised a number of concerns. The second one did have one recommendation, and that related to putting in place procedures that were more robust in ensuring things were tracked properly. The department has made progress in that area. The recommendation remains open. We're continuing to track it, and then we'll continue to look at that in the course of the ongoing audit.
And so you continue to look for perfection, as you should.
Absolutely, sir.
The second thing, the findings that you, beyond the recommendations for the procedures, the findings, did you find any indication that there was a diversion of equipment of any kind?
Again, the second set of projects that we've released or evaluations looking at the controls that DoD has over this end-use monitoring and enhanced end-use monitoring. Once the weaponry goes into Ukraine, there needs to be appropriate accountability and tracking, and so the DoD has responsibilities to do that. So in the first of those reports, we did make a number of findings and recommendations. Most of those have been addressed and the recs have been closed. There are a couple that are outstanding relating to night vision goggles and steps that are being taken. The department has made progress in those areas, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at the current state of that in connection with the newly announced EEUM evaluation that I mentioned. So there's been progress, and that's an ongoing process.
Very good, and I would just comment quickly. I'm very pleased that you're setting up a very robust operation in Ukraine itself, that you're reestablishing within the embassy the various auditing groups necessary to carry it out. Is that the case?
Well, what we have done, sir, is we've forward deployed a significant number of people into the region to do oversight over the supply and training mission, most of which occurs before any weaponry crosses into Ukraine. Then, using some of the same techniques, frankly, we used during, and not just my office, but across the IG community during the COVID pandemic, we're doing additional monitoring relating to the EUM and EEUM and getting information from the military personnel who are at the embassy regarding what's currently being done. If we need to go further and go in, we will, but at this point, we have it covered.
Good. Thank you very much. Bottom line is that the programs are working, that diversions are not happening, and the equipment's getting where it needs to go. Is that it?
We're doing oversight to make sure the department has placed all the controls it needs to make sure that happens, sir.
Didn't quite get to what I'm talking about. You've not found problems of any great significance. Is that correct?
Right. Well, again, a lot of these audits and evaluations are pending, but with regard to the areas I've mentioned, we had limited findings. The department has been addressing them, and we're going to continue to look at the issues. So, yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. We look at the gains that Ukraine has made with assistance from around the world and what's happening to Russian forces. Degraded presence, about 40% of its pre-war fleet of tanks gone, and today 97% of the Russian army is in Ukraine. And even with that, they're struggling. The issue is, for us, the munitions that we're providing to Ukraine. In last year's NDAA, we provided both funding and contracting tools to accelerate replenishing our munition stockpiles, essentially our weapons magazines. I want to talk, though, about where I think there's a strategic mismatch. We give those contracting tools, yet how we evaluate where the needs are, to me, is in contradiction to that. The needs are supposed to be evaluated on the threats in Europe. What's that threat scenario? And as we see, the DOD has up to 2 years to determine that threat scenario. So if we're looking at the scenario 2 years down the road and whatever is happening at that time in Europe, and we are today accelerating the replenishing of our munition stockpile, to me there's a mismatch, because giving 2 years to determine what the needs are, what the threats are, and we're spinning up today to build weapon stockpiles that may be mismatched with what we see 2 years from now, doesn't seem to me to be a good policy. So, Dr. Call, can you tell us, based on our force structure requirements on both munitions and ground forces in Europe, how do we make sure that we are making the right determinations about what to build today so we don't have, again, a mismatch? I mean, we're talking about weapons magazines being depleted today, but if we're building weapons that may not have a role in where we need to be 2 years from now, how do we correct that mismatch?
Yes, thank you. It's a very important question. So obviously we've made significant investments because of the money that Congress has generously given us and the authorities to spend it over longer periods of time to recapitalize our munitions. That means increasing production, but it also means addressing supply chain bottlenecks and creating a longer-term demand so that industry is actually responsive. I think what the Ukraine conflict showed is that, frankly, our defense industrial base was not at the level that we needed it to be to generate munitions. So right now, our priorities are making sure that we are increasing production for the things that we anticipate that Ukraine will continue to need. So a good example is 155 millimeter ammunition for the NATO standard howitzers, but also the guided multiple launch rocket systems, the Gimlers that launch off the HIMARS systems. Those are going to matter a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, because even if the conflict in Ukraine dies down, and nobody can predict whether that'll happen, Ukraine is going to need a military that can defend the territory it's clawed back and deter the Russians from doing this again. The other investments we're doing, of course, are to replenish our own stocks, and they are actually, I think we're relatively confident we're making the investments that we need not only for Russia contingencies, but also for contingencies vis-a-vis China, North Korea, Iran, et cetera. But beyond that, we can go into some of the specific details in the classified setting if you'd like in terms of how we're making targeted investments.
Well, that leads me to the next question. The allocations that we're making today to Ukraine are based on a pre-Ukraine Russian conflict scenario. So if we are holding back those munitions based on that scenario, then are we inadvertently holding back the things that Ukraine may need based on what would be an antiquated scenario? So that I think is a question. And then also, How are the determinations made about what we are doing to replenish our stockpiles and what we're sending to Ukraine? How is that interacting with our needs in the Indo-PACOM?
Yeah, so actually, it's a very important point. So we have a total munitions requirement that is essentially a metric against which we need munitions for a whole range of contingencies. So they're not pegged to any one contingency. It's a pool of munitions we could draw on from a range of different scenarios. We have adjusted that floor to account for the fact that Russia is bogged down in Ukraine. Their land forces have been badly attrited. It has changed the dynamic for a future Russia contingency. At the same time, we have requirements for operational plans in other parts of the world, could be North Korea, Iran, China, et cetera. And so Secretary Austin has been laser focused on making sure that as we draw down from our own stocks, we are getting Ukraine what it needs without taking undue risk to those other plans. And I think we have so far accomplished that. But we also need to recapitalize so that we can build up that hedge in the event that something bad happens elsewhere in the world.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, now you recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and certainly appreciate the ongoing insight and the most recent visit to the region. The amazing thing that the United States does better than anybody in world, hands down, is the logistics, the ability to move men, equipment, resources is short of remarkable. I just want to touch base, Chairman of TAL, Mr. Whitman. 3 years ago, there were some disturbing reports on the industrial base issues on our ammo plants, our explosives and accelerants, and we had been very much focused on that. Had we not actually sped up the recapitalization, I think we would be even in worse place, but we still have quite a ways to go. My question goes to Dr. Call and the General. Putin leaves no chance when he speaks to the people of not only his country but the world, but to imply the nuclear option over and over again. And it finds an audience in the United States. People are worried about what might happen. We've seen time and time again, there's a discussion about the red lines and what they are. And if we go back a year, what a red line was then certainly may or may not be the red line of today, and that's what I want to ask about the evolving or changing red lines. The calculations that we have made, and HIMARS is one of those discussions. Early on, we didn't want to do it. What calculations are going into effect that something that we are providing is or is not going to change the red lines? How do we determine what those red lines are and how have they changed since the beginning? Doctor, if you could go first.
Yeah, it's something we watch very closely, I think for all the reasons that you've mentioned. Clearly, Putin's rhetoric from the very outset of the war on nuclear matters has been irresponsible and dangerous. We've attempted not to take the bait while in private, making it clear to them that if they were to cross certain lines of using nuclear weapons on any scale, what a world-changing event that would be. As a general matter, I do not think that we are holding back security assistance from Ukraine at the moment, largely for escalatory reasons. I think most of the decisions we are making on security assistance are driven first and foremost by our assessment of what Ukraine needs right now, given the amount of money that the American taxpayer has given the department to work with. How do we use that money for what they need right now? And then the other is, what can we provide that doesn't have huge impacts on our own readiness and our ability to respond to our own national security crises in other parts of the world. So really, those are the two things that we are measuring against. I think at the moment we feel relatively comfortable on where we are on the escalatory dynamic vis-a-vis Russia, but it's something that we consult with our intelligence community colleagues constantly to make sure we're setting the rheostat, about right without self-deterring ourselves.
Thank you. So, General, when we started a year ago, there's been much discussion from the committee and those in Congress about what we're able to send to them. How much of an impact has that, quote, red line been, and has it changed since a year ago?
Sure, I would tell you what we've sent over the last year has made a gigantic difference to the Ukrainians. If you start where we were last year at the onset, it was about providing things at the moment that they needed. They were javelins, they were Stinger missiles, they were things that they needed to defeat the Russian army as they came across the border around the country. Those things were provided in good order. They were used extremely well by the Ukrainians. As the conditions changed, so too did the requests from the Ukrainians in terms of what they thought was necessary. And as we talked with our Ukrainian counterparts, what we thought would be most advantageous and available to them, all the while, as Dr. Call mentioned earlier, balancing it against our current readiness and our ability to meet any requirements around the world. Those have certainly morphed over time. And so as you've seen, sir, now the provision of Bradley fighting vehicles, of tanks, and our partners make these same assertions. They've all been done with these things in mind. And I feel very confident that as we go forward, we'll continue to do so and make decisions in a very thoughtful and understanding manner.
Exactly my point, that we are not holding back because of these red lines or nuclear threats. These are actual determinations made by what's best for the Ukrainians and their use at any time. With that, I yield back. Thanks.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panel being here for this timely hearing on the oversight of U.S. military support to Ukraine. Mr. Storch, can you tell us roughly how much money has been given total to the Ukrainian war effort since we began last year?
Well, it depends a little bit how you count it, but I believe it's over $113 billion approximately.
How much is that for lethal aid or what we'd consider standard military equipment?
I'm afraid I don't have that number at my fingertips.
So not a breakdown, roughly 60-40, 20-80 in terms of what's going to the government, what's going to military aid?
There's security assistance, there's economic assistance, there's humanitarian assistance. The numbers are in the JSOP, but it's approximately, I think, a little over 60% of it is the military assistance.
Okay, and I ask this question because whether our constituencies back home are for or against this war, they don't have the benefit of the hearings that we have, the classified briefings that we have, and so we want to know that we can tell the taxpayers that our money is being spent wisely. And this hearing today is coming on the heels of a CIGAR report released this week titled "Why the Afghan Security Forces Collapsed," in which the Special Inspector General reports, among other things, that rampant corruption gradually eroded the capabilities of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, as well as the legitimacy of the Afghan government. So we need to make sure we don't make those same mistakes in Ukraine. And a month ago, John Kirby claimed from the administration that he has not seen any signs so far that our budgetary assistance has fallen prey to any kind of corruption. Would you agree with that statement?
So on the issue of corruption, one of the reasons we do all these reviews is to ensure the integrity of the systems in place and that controls are there so to help to prevent it from corruption. And then, as I mentioned, we have DCIS that's there to investigate any allegations that might arise. With regard to the Afghanistan report, I'd just say I'm aware that's been issued. Our folks are looking at that. But it's obviously a very different situation in Ukraine, very different mission. In Ukraine, there aren't large numbers of troops on the ground. It's not building the military from the ground up. It's primarily a train and supply mission, something our office is very well equipped to oversee.
Right. And the Inspector General went on to say in his report that the United States played into the hands of political leaders and contributed to their corruption by spending money faster than it can be accounted for. So I think when we say we've spent roughly $100 billion, we ought to break that down and have a clear message from DOD, and we've had hearings where we've suggested that to keep the public on board. I understand what the strategy is and what the benefit is, but we want to make sure the people back home get this. And it didn't help last year, for example, in a briefing, unnamed senior official said that there was about 100 kamikaze Switchblade drones provided to Ukraine, that they couldn't tell where they were, who was using them, and didn't know if they'd ever know exactly where they come from or where they would be used at. And so those type of statements aren't helpful. But I think that you'd mentioned earlier that we have a proven model, and maybe you can elaborate and make us feel a little bit better that this proven model that you're referencing has worked somewhere else, and that we're accounting for the equipment that we're sending.
Yes, sir, absolutely. We do have a proven model, I believe, using the lead IG model that's been used in overseas contingency operations, showing how we can work together as an oversight community to provide comprehensive oversight. So we currently are engaged, for instance, on oversight over the Operation Enduring Sentinel mission, the over-the-horizon counterterrorism mission that's followed on in Afghanistan. And we have a number of projects at DoD, OIG related to that. We're also coordinating with our partners. We report out quarterly in public reports on our work in that area. It's obviously an area where we've done a lot of other work as well. But the point of it is, with Ukraine, we have not just the three of us, but actually 20 different oversight entities, including GAO, including all the military audit agencies, and all the rest working together to ensure that there aren't any gaps, that we're covering the waterfront and all types of assistance, security, economic, humanitarian, other assistance, that we're doing oversight over all of it, so the American public knows that the taxpayer dollars are being spent.
Is there a specific example, like loss reports is due within a specific time, say 30 days, or a condition that they give us 100% accuracy on inventory, or is there anything in place that would make more clarity? Because it seems like we all say that this is accounted for, but yet there's a lot of disparity when we ask for specific examples of how we know this equipment's accounted for.
So we're doing a robust series of oversight projects to ensure the accountability of equipment from the very beginning until it gets into Ukraine. And then once it's in Ukraine, we're doing continued work in that critical area I mentioned.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. We recently marked the one-year anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. During that year, the United States and many other nations have stepped up to provide aid. The United States has provided approximately $30 billion in security assistance. That has been instrumental in allowing Ukraine to keep fighting. It is important we conduct thorough oversight of taxpayer dollars going to this cause, and I think we have been doing just that. Dr. Call, we want the war to end quickly and on Ukraine's terms. You stated in your testimony that our goal is to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position for future negotiations. Within the 5-year near-term focus areas, how is the department working with industry to maximize production in support of Ukraine and in backfilling our defense stocks that have been leveraged to date?
Thank you for that. So DoD is working with industry to increase production of certain capabilities to continue meeting the needs of Ukrainian forces while ensuring that the United States is ready to defend itself and our allies and partners, and this is that balancing act. And DoD has identified over $2 billion of industrial base investments to increase and or accelerate production of things like Javelin, Stinger, HIMARS, these guided multiple launch rocket systems, 155 millimeter artillery shells, and Patriot missiles. And we're also trying to make the best use of the multi-year authorities that Congress has given to us to make sure that we're getting after the munitions challenges more broadly.
Thank you. Dr. Call, while we hope for a quick end to this conflict, we must plan, obviously, for the long term. How do the 5 focus areas evolve over time, and what long efforts can we start planning for deployment in the long term to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs for continued defense against Russia? That doesn't seem like it is going to go away.
Well, you know, as the president has said, we're in it for as long as it takes. You know, Putin's theory of success is that he can outlast everybody, outlast the Ukrainians, outlast the United States, outlast NATO and the rest of the world. We're going to prove that that's just the latest of a string of miscalculations by Putin. I think, as Lieutenant General Sims noted, what we have prioritized has adjusted across the course of the war. So in the initial period of the war, when it was essential for Ukraine to win the Battle of Kyiv and to use systems they could get right now, right away, we emphasized anti-armor systems like Javelin, man-portable air defense systems, loitering munitions, drones, Soviet legacy ammunition, artillery, and air defense systems. As the conflict shifted to the east, we focused on NATO standard artillery systems and also providing them HIMARS and the Gimlers. This winter, we have focused on more advanced air defense systems, so think NASAMS, Patriot, but also armored and mechanized systems to help them change the dynamic going into the spring and summer. And so we will continue that process as we move forward, as Ukraine's needs change. And I do think it is incumbent upon all of us to think about what Ukraine needs over the medium term to make sure they can defend whatever territory they claw back from the Russians and deter the Russians from going at it again when and if there's a halting to the fighting or a peace settlement, or even if there isn't. And so the department is focused on constantly iterating on that analysis.
Do you think we're succeeding to that end?
I think we are. Look, I think that if we're all honest with ourselves about where we thought things would be a year ago when Russia launched this invasion, I think it was a pretty dire, pessimistic assessment. And while I don't know how the war is going to end, I think we already know one conclusion for sure, which is that Russia has lost. Russia has lost. They intended to take over all of Ukraine. That didn't happen. It's not going to happen. They intended to divide NATO. NATO is stronger. They intended for Russia to emerge out of this war a great power in a multipolar world. They will emerge from this conflict a shattered military power. And so, again, I don't know exactly where the final lines will be drawn when this conflict comes to a close, but I know our policy has been successful in keeping a sovereign, democratic, independent Ukraine alive and ensuring that Vladimir Putin suffers a loss.
Thank you, Dr. Call. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Storch, you're our watchdog. Ukraine has a corruption problem, right?
There's a long history of issues with corruption in Ukraine.
Infrastructure minister arrested for stealing $400,000. Deputy head of Zelensky's office can't explain where the sports cars came from, so he had to resign. Deputy defense minister resigned over contracting corruption, but the defense ministry put out a statement that his resignation was a worthy deed. And the wife of a former Ukrainian politician was found with $22 million in cash crossing the border into Hungary last year. It seems as though a lot of the zeal for enforcement of the anti-corruption efforts seems to align with the Republican control of the House of Representatives in our country. Maybe that's a coincidence. But let's get to this end-use monitoring you testified to. The Arms Control Act of 1996 requires end-use monitoring for certain defense articles that are sold or leased, right?
Correct.
And there's no feature of anything we've passed that exempts what we've given to Ukraine from those requirements in the Arms Control Act, right?
Not exempts. There are different provisions as to how that plays out in different circumstances.
That is controlling law, controlling policy. And here's the upshot. As you testify here today, you cannot testify, truthfully under oath, that the DOD has complied with the policy and law regarding end-use monitoring during all times of this conflict. Isn't that right?
So I want to be careful here when I respond to you, Congressman, to make sure that I'm clear. We are conducting a series of evaluations that look at the controls that DOD has in place to ensure that they are taking the steps that are required.
I get all that, but here's the operative question. We haven't complied with end-use monitoring according to the law with everything we've sent to Ukraine to date, have we?
So our 2020 report, which is our last public report on this, made a number of recommendations. All of those have been met.
I know, but you're sort of dodging the question. You cannot testify that we have complied with the end-use monitoring requirements at all times during this conflict, can you?
So we have an ongoing evaluation right now.
I get that it's ongoing. I'm looking backwards. You cannot testify that everything is complied with the law in the end-use monitoring, can you?
So some of that gets into the classified report that we issued previously.
But I think everyone watching this could see that if you could testify to that, you would. You're citing a classified report. I don't know why that report's classified. I think the American people deserve to know if this 1996 law is being followed or not. You can't testify that it is being followed, and so I think they can draw reasonable conclusions from that. Do we have, Dr. Call, do we have DOD personnel in Ukraine now?
We do. We have a couple dozen at the embassy.
Other than the embassy, any other personnel?
Nope.
How about CIA? Are they training folks in Ukraine?
Not going to talk about that in an unclassified setting. Happy to talk about that further in the classified briefing.
Is the Azov battalion getting access to U.S. weapons?
Not that I'm aware of, but if you have information,
I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the Global Times investigative report that that talks about training. It's from the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, citing that the Azov Battalion was even getting stuff as far back as 2018.
Without objection, so ordered.
Any reason to disagree with that assessment?
Is this the, I'm sorry, is this the Global Times from China?
No, this is,
That's what you read.
yeah, it might be. Yeah, would that be a reason?
As a general matter, I don't take Beijing's
Well,
propaganda.
no,
at
yeah,
face
but just tell me
value.
if the allegation is true or false. I mean,
I don't have any evidence one way or the other. As a general matter, I don't take Beijing's propaganda at face value.
fair enough. I would agree with that assessment. April 2022, President Biden is describing the supplemental funding that we're providing to Ukraine. He says, quote, "It's also going to help schools and hospitals open. It's going to allow pensions and social support to be paid to the Ukrainian people so they have something in their pocket." So help me understand how U.S. taxpayers paying for pensions in Ukraine is a good idea for our country.
I would defer you to other parts of our government. The Department of Defense doesn't have a role in pensions in Ukraine.
You're a senior Biden administration official. The president said that it's really important that we keep funding the pensions in Ukraine. I would observe that the U.S. Census Bureau says that in 2022, the U.S. pension shortfall is $1.4 trillion. So while we have a corrupt Ukrainian government, while we have our watchdog here who can't say that we followed the law on end-use monitoring, we have the President of the United States saying we need to fund pensions in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the pensions of our fellow Americans are in greater jeopardy. Mr. Chairman, I see that my time has expired, but I seek unanimous consent to enter a number of articles into the record. If I may.
Objection so ordered.
Very well.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Call, one of the experts who I was talking to told me that Russia has 6 times the artillery as Ukraine. Is that true?
Not anymore. I think the reality is that we don't know precisely how much artillery Russia has left, but we do know that they have expended an extraordinary amount of it and that they are running low, which is why they're turning to the likes of North Korea and others in desperate search of more artillery.
Where would you put the ratio at now?
It's hard to say. We could talk more about this precisely in the classified setting, and a lot of it also depends on the assumptions you make about the viability of ammunition that Russia has had in storage for 40 or 50 years, going back to the Soviet days, so it's a little bit of an art rather than a science. I do think the Russians continue to have artillery, but they are suffering tremendous shortages at the front of artillery, which is why they're turning to countries like North Korea.
And as someone who deeply admires the president's policy and Tony Blinken's role, your role, and has voted for all the aid packages, I guess my question is, what is your confidence level at this point that Ukraine will be able to hold all the territory it currently holds in a war of attrition?
I think that, as Lieutenant General Sims has testified, the front line right now is kind of a grinding slog, and you're likely to see incremental gains on both sides. So, for example, the Russians have made some incremental gains around Bakhmut in recent weeks and months, but at the cost of thousands and thousands of casualties in these human wave attacks from the Wagner prisoners and others. So you may see small portions of territory change hands in the coming weeks and months. I do not think that there's anything I see that suggests the Russians can sweep across Ukraine and make significant territorial gains anytime in the next year or so. And we are making sure the Ukrainians have the capabilities to stop them from doing that, while at the same time giving them the capabilities to go on the offensive themselves to claw back more territory.
And I assume, Dr. Collier, assumption is contingent on the House continuing to support Ukraine with aid, or are you saying already with what we've given?
No, I mean, well, so first of all, the House, the Senate, the American people have been extraordinarily generous. We've spent about $31.7 billion in security assistance over the last year. We have about $12 billion remaining from the money that you all provided at the end of last year for the remainder of this fiscal year. It is true that Ukraine continues to depend on assistance from the United States and our allies and partners, and that will be true for some period of time. So yes, if the world walked away from Ukraine, then the balance would tip in Russia's favor, but there is no reason to believe.
And how many more rounds of aid do you expect? And I say this as someone who supported him and wants to continue to support him, but just in terms of the American public, how many more times do you think Congress needs to provide aid?
You know, it's difficult, and it's difficult because we don't know the course and trajectory of the conflict. The conflict could end 6 months from now. It could end 2 years from now or 3 years from now. I think the president has said that the United States will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. I think we've had a good conversation today about why that's in the vital national interest of the United States. So I would hope that Congress would continue to be supportive. But we should only come and ask for what Ukraine really needs, and as this conversation has said, what we can account for and demonstrate to the American people is actually benefiting our interests.
And what do you think at the end is the end game? I mean, obviously we talk about a just peace. What does that look like to you, and how do we get there?
Well, of course, Ukraine has detailed its principles for a just peace. We just had more than 140 countries in the UN General Assembly essentially ratify their approach. I think a just peace would involve Russia withdrawing from the territory that they have illegally occupied from Ukraine. But ultimately, the Ukrainians are going to be the ones that determine what peace settlement is acceptable or not. Our position has been to make sure that at whatever point they enter into those conversations, they do so from a position of strength.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Call, did we successfully deter Russia from invading Ukraine? Did deterrence work? We had a whole series of diplomatic, economic sanctions, the most powerful sanctions the world has ever seen, not to mention our ongoing security assistance at the time. Did that work? Was it successful?
Clearly, because he invaded Ukraine, Putin was not deterred.
So it's safe to say deterrence failed in this case.
Well, one possibility is also that Putin was not deterrable as it related to going into Ukraine. He has been deterred as it relates to going after the United States or NATO.
So you would postulate that no matter what we provided Ukraine, deterrence would have failed?
I actually think that our intelligence community is split on this view. Their assessment was that almost no amount of weapons prior to the conflict could have deterred Putin from going into Ukraine.
Well, I asked this in the sense that I was in Ukraine the month before. And at the time, the answer that the Ukrainians were receiving, that we received, was that Stingers, too escalatory, anti-ship missiles, too provocative, long-range artillery, certainly off the books and improbable. Other things will take too long to train on. And what we've seen is Stingers too provocative, then we provide them. Harpoons too provocative, then we provide them. HIMARS can't do that, then we give them. Patriots, absolutely not, then we give them. Tanks, Bradleys, heck no, takes too long. Now here we are a year later, we're providing them. I think, as we're patting ourselves on the back, providing an ally the arms they need to defend themselves, if we've decided it's within our interest after entire cities and whole regions have been devastated, probably isn't a good strategy. Would you agree with that?
Well, we did provide hundreds of millions of dollars in assistance in the months leading up to the war. And then, of course, Congress...
Actually, if we really rewind the clock, starting in 2014, we provided only non-lethal aid until 2017. Was that a mistake?
Well, I was then National Security Advisor to then Vice President Biden, and he favored providing lethal assistance like javelins. That's everybody knows that.
And the Obama administration
made a different decision.
Was that a mistake?
I think in retrospect, we should have provided them Javelin missiles. That's been the position of then Vice President Biden.
The Trump administration then provided.
It was a complicated tale,
right.
I think, as you
So
recall from the transcript.
Let's move to burden sharing, because I think this is absolutely an issue I hear from my constituents and something we need to address as a policy matter. The United States provided $30 billion in security assistance. The next nearest is Germany at $3.5, a tenth of what we've provided. UK less than $3 billion, France less than $1 billion. They're in the 100 millions, and poor Estonia has provided 3 times, just by percentage of GDP, what France has provided. So all in total, even though our economies of the EU and the United States roughly the same, the Europeans have provided less than half of what we have, and we haven't even gotten into the rest that makes up the full $100 billion. Is that fair? Is that effective burden sharing?
Well, obviously, we've been working with our allies and partners throughout, and the Secretary of Defense has held now 9 of these Ukraine defense contact groups. They meet monthly.
No, I understand.
I'm going to answer your question. If you actually take the top 20 contributors of security assistance to Ukraine as a percentage of GDP, the United States ranks 10th. And there are a number of European countries that are above the bar. You mentioned Estonia. Latvia is also up there, but countries like Poland, Finland, Norway, Denmark, the Czech Republic, Sweden are all above us as a percentage of GDP. And then some of the countries that you mentioned are below us in terms
But I'm talking about right on the front lines, clearly in their interest, Germany in particular. What have we done to get Germany and France and Italy and these large economies clearly in the heart of NATO, in the heart of Europe, and directly, if we buy into the matter that this is in our interest because if Putin slices through Ukraine, he'll keep going. What have we done effectively to get them to step up to the plate, at least dollar for dollar, dollar for euro?
I mean, I think the Defense Department has certainly worked alongside the White House and the State Department on diplomacy in this regard from the very beginning. That's why the Secretary of Defense holds these monthly meetings. They started in Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The Germans, as of now, have provided $3.58 billion. The UK has provided $2.85 billion.
I read out the statistics.
Yeah.
I would just postulate, going forward, over the long term, just as we had in the Gulf War, where we had an effective diplomatic effort to pay for this, that this is a global issue.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair,
I think we need to do a lot more to
Mr.
get Europe
Keating
to
for
step
5
up.
minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for having this hearing on an ongoing basis on an important issue of oversight. This is an all-government approach that we have here. Secretary Yellen is in Ukraine right now, and we do have sanctions that no country has ever seen before. In terms of your area, particularly Mr. Storch, or for anyone that's here, some of those new sanctions, how helpful will they be in terms of the people that are trying to skirt those existing sanctions and get around them, and how helpful will they be in the overall effort?
Well, I'll just start from the oversight perspective. We have this working group. Part of the working group is the Department of Treasury OIG, so it's probably more a question for them than for the DoD OIG, because we have oversight over the security assistance. In terms of the policy decision, that's not really sort of what OIGs do, so I'll turn it over to Dr. Call.
I'll just say, I think obviously the sanctions have put a dent in the Russian economy. We'll continue to magnify that. I think from a DoD perspective, the bigger constraint on the Russians is more likely to be the export controls, which are making it very difficult for Russia to recapitalize the military that has been shattered in Ukraine.
Okay. Just a quick question. Does Germany have different laws than we do in terms of their defense?
I mean, all the allies and partners we work with have different constraints, different laws. You know, Germany was not, one of the reasons we didn't provide lethal assistance back in the Obama administration was because Germany was so opposed to doing it. So the fact that they provide any lethal assistance was a huge sea change for them. Now, I know that's frustrating for a lot of folks who want our allies and partners to do the most they can. We share that desire. But yes, our allies and partners all have their own domestic political constraints, their own domestic regulations, and a lot of them have had to change their own laws and practices in order to provide the historic support for Ukraine that we've seen.
Okay. Question, you know, when we read something in the newspaper regarding someone being dismissed from a position in Ukraine and being replaced, you know, this is a sovereign issue that each country has. They make their own decisions. But just a question, and I want to do this so we can avoid classified setting. Just a question generally. If those decisions are made and they do deal with something that would be a concern in our oversight and everything, is that communicated to the U.S. and their allies informally?
I would say sometimes we're aware of the moves before they happen, and sometimes we're aware when we read about them, just like you do. I think the point from our matter of U.S. policy is that the importance of getting after corruption in Ukraine or anywhere else is at the top of our points of emphasis with Ukrainian leaders. I do think they are taking these issues seriously. I think it's a problem they're going to continue to work on, but the fact that they're making any progress in the midst of this existential fight, I think, is quite remarkable, frankly.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Storch, just an observation. I was a prosecutor before I was a member of Congress. And, you know, when there's a line of questioning that occurs, and your job is one of monitoring and an ongoing investigation, whether something's there or not, but you're in the process of doing it, and you're asked the question publicly about what the outcome of that might be before it ever occurs. That must put you in a very difficult position to answer a question, and it might give the perception you're not answering the question when indeed you're not able to answer the question if you're doing your job properly. You want to comment on sometimes on the difficulty of that line of questioning when it's posed in a public setting like it is here?
I appreciate very much the observation, and that's exactly right, obviously. You know, our job in the IG community is to do independent oversight, and as an old boss of mine used to say, we hit it right down the fairway. I can't do that in golf, but my office does that in oversight. And so we're looking at these issues, we're trying to determine what happens, and we're going to report out as transparently as we can, but to try to get ahead of an ongoing audit or evaluation or to talk about, I can't even begin to speculate about investigations, puts us in a very difficult position. So I appreciate the sensitivity. If I can on corruption, I'd just add, when I was over in Kyiv, that was one of the things we really emphasized, both myself and my counterparts from the other two OIGs, and we met with everybody up to the Prime Minister and down the Minister of Defense and others, the importance of ensuring that corruption was being addressed and that we're being transparent about it. They all said they understood that. Now, obviously, as a career prosecutor at an IG, you know, we're in the trust but verify business, but certainly they indicated that they understand that issue. And finally, I just add that sort of in one of life's coincidences, I actually previously worked in Ukraine as a resident legal advisor for the Department of Justice, working on anti-corruption issues. So I hope that perspective helps my office as we look at what's going on here.
I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Call, you helped write the dangerous Obama-era Iran deal, the JCPOA. You helped negotiate it. Last November, President Biden was caught on video saying the deal was dead. Yet just this month, the administration has renewed sanctions waivers that are key to the deal. Why, in your opinion, is the Biden administration so hell-bent on reentering the new Iran deal?
Thank you for your question. Just as a technical matter, I was not involved in the negotiation of the Iran deal.
You helped write it.
I didn't.
Fair?
But
you were involved with it?
Well, I worked in the administration when the deal was negotiated. The President and Secretary Blinken and others in the administration have made clear that we're not about to re-enter the JCPOA anytime soon.
Why did they attempt to re-enter it?
Well, because Iran's nuclear progress since we left the JCPOA has been remarkable. Back in 2018, when the previous administration decided to leave the JCPOA, it would have taken Iran about 12 months to produce one bomb's worth of fissile material. Now it would take about 12 days. And so I think there is still the view that if you can resolve this issue diplomatically and put constraints back on their nuclear program, it is better than the other options. But right now, the JCPOA is on ice because there was an arrangement on the table last summer that the Iranians were not willing to take. And of course, Iran's behavior has changed since then, not the least of which their support for Russia in Ukraine, which is the subject of the conversation here today. So I don't think we're on the precipice of re-entering the JCPOA.
So you're declaring defeat for the new Iran deal on behalf of the Biden administration?
I think our view, actually, I'm just stating what both the President and Secretary of State have already said, which is that the JCPOA is not on the horizon in the near term. The administration's position remains that a diplomatic deal to put constraints around Iran's program remains the best alternative to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But the President has also made clear that his policy is that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon, period, and that if a diplomatic outcome is not possible, that we have other options to deal with that problem.
So does it concern you that Putin and China are on the side of negotiating the same deal that you helped craft during the Obama administration?
There are no active P5+1 negotiations, so China and Russia being at the table or not being at the table are not terribly germane.
Can you shed light for us on why we tapped Russians to help negotiate on America's behalf in the renewed negotiations during the Biden administration?
It's not clear to me what you're referencing, but I think that during the Obama administration, at least, the Russians were able to compartmentalize differences that we had in some areas and the common view of not wanting Iran to get a nuclear weapon. I think we're not in the same place right now because the Russians, because of how badly they're doing in Ukraine, are becoming increasingly dependent on Iran, and therefore I think are a lot less likely to put pressure of any kind on Iran to accede to any diplomatic agreement, because they're trying to get Iran to ship them more drones, missiles, and other capabilities.
In 2021, did you expect the invasion of Ukraine?
In 2021, in 2021, we warned the world about. I'm sorry.
You expected it? You anticipated it?
Beginning in the fall, I think it's of public record. Beginning in the fall, we had very good intelligence that Vladimir Putin was putting the pieces in place to be able to carry out a large-scale invasion. We began to downgrade, declassify, and share that information with the world in the fall of 2021.
Then why shed light for us? Then why did the Biden administration lift sanctions on Nord Stream 2 if we anticipated it?
Well, I think the timelines are different in those. You should correct me if the record is different. I believe the Nord Stream conversations were several months before. And largely that was in order to stay united with Germany, but also to give us a leverage point. In fact, what's interesting is that had that not gone forward, the ability of Germany to then essentially walk away from the deal would not have been effective punishment or leverage over the Russians. But these were not linked in time.
In hindsight, should we regret that decision to lift those sanctions?
You know, I work at the Defense Department. I wasn't involved in any of those deliberations, so I'd really refer those questions to the Treasury Department and State Department. I don't have an opinion on that conversation. No, I don't.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thanks.
Chair now recognizes a gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been a staunch advocate for providing support to Ukraine since President Putin's unjustified invasion just about a year ago. Given my past in the Air Force, it probably isn't a shock to anyone that I'm particularly advocating for the transfer of American aircraft. In fact, I started doing that in April of last year, and most recently in a letter with my colleagues from the Four-Country Caucus. We asked President Biden to transfer specifically F-16 aircraft to the Ukrainian military, as President Zelensky requested. I understand that on Friday that President Biden said in an interview that Ukraine, quote, doesn't need F-16s now, and on Sunday, NSA advisor Jake Sullivan emphasized that, quote, F-16s are a question for a later time. Last year, I also proudly co-led a bill with our former colleague, Rep. Kinzinger, to authorize funding to provide training for Ukrainian fighter pilots, recognizing that, of course, training may need to happen before they are ready to fly our jets, and in the event that we ultimately do transfer them. We submitted this language for inclusion in last year's NDAA, and the final law included that language authorizing the United States to provide training for Ukrainian soldiers, both on manned and unmanned aerial capabilities, including tactical surveillance systems and fixed and rotary aircraft, such as attack, strike, airlift, and surveillance aircraft. So my 2 or 3 questions for you. Undersecretary Call, in your written testimony, you noted that you have expanded U.S.-led training of Ukrainian air forces on combined arms and joint maneuver operations. Could you speak to whether or not this training included aircraft such as authorized by the fiscal year 23 NDAA? That's my first question. My second question also for you is, what exactly would a later time be, as you know, quoted by President Biden? And we may finally have to save this for our classified briefing, but could you please elaborate on what information the President is relying on, or perhaps was relying on, when he said that Ukraine doesn't need F-16s now, despite pleas from Ukraine's own president?
Thank you for that. So, no, we have not started training on F-16s. Our assessment is that a delivery timeline for F-16s, even on the most expeditious timeline, and the training timelines are essentially the same. That is, they're about 18 months. And so you don't actually save yourself time by starting the training early in our assessment. And since we haven't made the decision to provide F-16s, and neither have our allies and partners, it doesn't make sense to start to train them on a system they may never get. I mean, they could end up getting British Tornadoes or Gripens or Mirage aircraft, and therefore you wouldn't want to train them on F-16. So it just, in our judgment, is not the appropriate time to start training. It is true that the President has, and the National Security Advisor have said that, you know, we don't see F-16s as the top priority right now. The President did have this conversation with President Zelensky in Kyiv last week. It is a priority for the Ukrainians, but it's not one of their top 3 priorities. Their top priorities are air defense systems, that is keeping their interceptors and air defense network alive against Russian cruise missiles and Iranian drones. artillery and fires, which we've talked about, and armor and mechanized systems. A couple of just data points on F-16s that I think actually speaks to your second and third questions. We've looked at this very carefully about what it would take to get Ukraine F-16s. So if we were to do new production, it would take 3 to 6 years to get them F-16s. We could look at older block F-16s that could potentially deliver on a faster timeline, let's call it 18 to 24 months. Maybe you can even shave a few months off of that. Then the question would be how many? The Ukrainians have at times asked us for as many as 128 fourth-generation aircraft, a mix of F-15s, F-18s, and F-16s. Our Air Force estimates that over the long term, Ukraine would probably need 50 to 80 F-16s to replace their existing Air Force. If you did that with new F-16s, so say Block 70, 72s, that would cost $10 or $11 billion. If you did it with older Block 30 or 32 aircraft, and let's imagine you only did half, 36 of those, it would still cost $2 to $3 billion. And just as a reminder, that would consume a huge portion of the remaining security assistance that we have for this fiscal year. So these are the trade-offs that we are making in real time. Would it make sense to spend $3 billion on a capability that will arrive a year and a half from now when that $3 billion is needed for Patriot interceptors or more Bradley fighting vehicles or more 155 millimeter ammunition or more Gimlers, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the trade-offs we're making at the moment.
I'm nearly out of time. I appreciate that. I guess my only concern is when we started talking about this 10 months ago, 10 months has gone by, and so I just don't know when the clock should start. And when we see that this...
Gentlelady's time's expired. Chair,
I appreciate it. I yield back.
Gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Very important topic, very timely. I had a couple more questions about the end-use monitoring for Mr. Storch. Your office published a report in October stating that the Department of Defense was unable to provide in-use monitoring in accordance with DoD policy because of the limited U.S. presence in Ukraine. So the report identified the challenges that the DoD personnel who are responsible for conducting in-use monitoring and enhanced in-use monitoring face when there is no U.S. personnel present, or at least limited presence there. Have we learned any lessons or discovered any best practices to improve that in-use monitoring in Ukraine despite the lack of people there on the ground?
So to be clear, the report that was issued in October 2022 was a classified report, so happy to talk more in detail about that during the later session. I believe it's accurate to say that what the report did is it acknowledged the challenges that are faced in those circumstances, such as they were in Ukraine, and the steps that were being taken at the time to try to address those. And as I say, happy to talk more. The reason we initiated the current evaluation, and the reason I didn't want to get ahead of what we're finding, is that as the situation changes and conditions on the ground evolve, we want to go back, and we are going back and looking at what's going on now, what steps have been taken to try to adjust those challenges and where they are and how things move forward. And frankly, Congressman, given the importance of the issue, I think that's something we're going to be looking at as long as this goes on, right? And so that's where we are.
And I think we agree we have to do that. We owe it to all involved. And I know that there are classified portions, there probably are unclassified things that you could discuss, but does the department have any concerns about the self-reporting that is coming out of Ukraine? So, specifically, Ukraine, we all know Ukraine has a documented history of corruption and government waste in the past. I know a lot of that has been being alleviated, but what gives you confidence that the Ukrainians are being entirely forthcoming and transparent with us when it comes to what we've seen so far?
So, at some level, that's why we do these audits and reviews, right? So we want to look at the evidence and then be able to assess independently where things are. As I mentioned, I went to Kyiv. We met with the Prime Minister. We met with the Minister of Defense. They told us they understood the importance of addressing corruption. When we were out there, actually, coincidentally, a number of corruption cases had been announced. They very strongly pointed out those did not involve U.S. security assistance or U.S. assistance generally. But having said that, they were corruption cases, and the point they were making is they were trying to address them. So as I say, I've got a long history. I've been going out to Ukraine and working out there on behalf of the United States government for more than 15 years, and in the anti-corruption area. And so I hear what they're saying, and then we're in the trust but verify business. And the way we do that on this issue is by doing these evaluations that look at what's actually going on. Because again, there's sometimes a misunderstanding. We at the DoD OIG, we don't go out and count the missiles, right? We don't do the monitoring. It's up to the DoD to meet the requirements of the law and the policies that implement it regarding monitoring, and then we do oversight to make sure that's happening, that it's happening in accordance with the law and it's happening appropriately, and we make recommendations to help the DoD to improve that. So that's the process we're engaged in now, and as I say, I think we're going to continue to be engaged in.
There's just some inherent challenges, as we're acknowledging, when we don't have DoD personnel there. So we want to ensure, of course, that sensitive weapons end up where they're supposed to be. Do you think that we need U.S. inspectors on the ground to do that? Or, I mean, we're trust but verify. What are the details of that, I guess?
I'm sorry, do you mean from my office or DoD?
Well, U.S. inspectors.
I can talk to that a little.
Okay.
I can talk to that a little bit. So first of all, we're not just taking the Ukrainians' words for it. They provide us information on their inventories, their transfer logs. We have provided them handheld scanners. That data gets transmitted directly back to us so that we can keep custody. We have shared NATO standard inventory and logistics software, which we also have access to that data. And then, of course, we do have a presence at the embassy. We have an Office of Defense Cooperation, and they have done 6 different site visits out from Kyiv. These are day trips. It's a dangerous place, and we don't have outposts across the country. And they have seen no signs of diversion or that the Ukrainians are not following procedures. So, look, this is an active combat zone, and it's not like Iraq and Afghanistan where we have thousands of soldiers all over the country. So there are inherent restrictions, but we're trying to maximize the use of technology and the people we do have on the ground to get the best site picture as possible. And then, of course, the IG will do oversight to make sure we're doing our job the right way.
General time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Sherrill, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I recently met with many of our NATO allies and members of the Ukrainian parliament, and 2 things really became clear. One is that U.S. leadership has been effective. We have overseen a lot of the support for Ukraine, and our allies appreciate that, as well as our intelligence sharing.
I don't think your microphone's on. Yeah, you might want to borrow Miss Escobar's or Miss Lotkins.
Steal Miss Lotkins.
There you go.
Thank you. I was saying that 2 things have really become clear. U.S. leadership has been instrumental in this fight, and that has been noted by our allies across the world and appreciated. But sadly, what's also become clear is the broad-scale use of war crimes by the Russians, kidnapping of children, over 6,000 verified cases, and that's simply what we are able to verify. I'd say that's very low. Rape of mothers in front of their children, young children, rape of daughters and mothers, as I'm hearing from my Ukrainian community as they come into the district, targeting of civilian infrastructure. And so it becomes clear, and when you hear from the Ukrainian parliamentarians, you hear that they believe this is an attempt by the Russians to demoralize them, to make them want to quit this fight, when in fact it has had the opposite effect, an understanding of why this fight is so important. And so that is why we on this committee take our job so very seriously, for making sure that we can support Ukraine. And the only way we can continue to do that effectively is with the support of the American people. And so our understanding of the oversight, our understanding of how Ukrainians are overcoming their history of corruption is so important so we can convey it. And I really appreciate your explanation of all of the measures we have in place, but I don't think what is coming through is what I heard when I was on the ground in Kyiv from the embassy, that they are seeing all the weapons that come in get to the front. They are getting pictures of those weapons on the front lines. They are seeing them in use. They feel very confident that the weapons that we provide them at the border of Poland are in fact making it to the front, and we are certainly seeing their effective use time and time again. Can you talk a little bit more about why we believe that the weaponry that we have sent to Ukraine is in fact making it to the front, and how we have not seen we have not seen those weapons, for example, for sale on international markets? And maybe that's a question for Dr. Cox. I think, Mr. Storch, you are doing the aftermath of it, but how do we feel right now in time about providing all the assistance we've provided to Ukraine and our confidence that it is actually getting where we want it to go?
So part of it is what we're seeing, and part of it is what we're not seeing. So what we're not seeing is any evidence of significant diversion. I think our assessment is if some of these systems have been diverted, it's by Russians who have captured things on the battlefield, which always happens, but that there's no evidence that the Ukrainians are diverting it to the black market or some other thing else. That's not surprising given the intensity of the fight and the fact that they are clearly using what we are providing them and what our allies and partners are providing them to maximum effect. So they are asking us for more because they are using everything that we have provided them. I would just say as a general matter, you know, the inventory comes in to the various places in Europe where the security assistance flows in. All that inventory is taken note of. It's scanned, et cetera. It gets given to the Ukrainians. They are responsible for giving us the information on where it ends up and the logs of that information, sharing with us digital confirmation of where things go. They also have scanners. That information comes back to us, and they have this NATO standard software that helps keep inventory, which we also have access to that information, and we do these site visits. So look, this is an active war zone. There are always going to be things that you don't know are happening or you don't see, but we are not seeing any evidence of systemic diversion of the equipment that the United States has provided.
Thank you. And in my final few seconds, is there more we could be doing as a committee to support ensuring that the weapons are being used appropriately?
Well, I just say hearings like this are great. I think oversight and transparency is really important. The things that Dr. Call talks about, that's the information that we're getting as we have our teams out there doing evaluations, looking at every aspect of the security of this equipment from the beginning until it gets to the front lines in Ukraine, and to make sure that everything that can be done is being done to ensure that it's being used properly and as intended. So I think hearings like this are great, and we appreciate the committee's support as we do our oversight, and we'll keep you informed as we go forward.
Thank you. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. McClain, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to thank Mr. Rogers for giving me the opportunity to go on a CODEL and actually see the inventory of weapons that we are sending, and just how they are getting from point A to point B and how we're tracking them. You know, that I can assure you raised my level of confidence. There is a saying, one look is worth 1,000 reports. But I want to shift gears for just a moment, because although I think we're doing some things very well, I think we need a little bit of a reset with the American people, or I should just say my constituents in my district. They've been raising concerns with me about our involvement in this war. They're worried that we're getting dragged into a never-ending war with no clear and precise outcome that has been, in their opinion, right, or perceptions, 90% of reality, that has a clear end in sight. They believe that we're spending money and resources on a fight overseas rather than getting our own fiscal house in order. If you could, and anyone can answer, in simple terms, just lay out to the American people the reasons why it is so important for Ukraine to defeat Russia in this war, particularly from the eyes of the Americans. So what is the implications for the United States if Russia actually does defeat Ukraine?
I think the implications would be both in Europe and felt around the world. The United States did get dragged into 2 world wars in Europe because aggressors weren't stopped. Aggressors, initiated their conflict. The free world didn't hang together. Aggressors weren't deterred. They weren't stopped. And so the United States eventually was dragged into those conflicts. And we don't want to see that happening
So
again.
it's a deterrent, and I don't mean to put words in your mouths, but it's more of a deterrent so we don't end up into a world war.
I think it is to demonstrate to other would-be aggressors that if they engage in the type of aggression that Russia has, they would face similar consequences. And I think it will matter very much, for example, if you're sitting in Beijing wondering about crossing the Taiwan Strait, you will ask yourself, if I do that, will the world react like they did when we went after and absorbed Hong Kong, which was to just kind of look the other way, or the way the world reacted in Ukraine? And if it is the latter, then aggression across the Taiwan Strait is a lot less likely.
And can you expand on that, sir, just a little bit more? What would a Russian victory or defeat mean for China?
Well, I think, first of all, Russia is China's closest ally. They, of course, signed a strategic partnership without limits shortly before the war. We have seen growing indications that China might be considering providing Russia with some assistance, lethal assistance, which would be very troublesome. So China has a stake in the outcome here. But also, I think China would, they speak a lot about the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity, but frankly, China would benefit greatly from a world that allowed big powers to gobble up their small neighbors.
And would you care to comment, what would the loss of Ukraine mean for NATO?
Well, first of all, Ukraine's not going to lose. There will be no loss of Ukraine. I think Vladimir Putin hoped that would happen. It's not. It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. Ukraine continues to maintain most of its territory. They're fighting tenaciously. The Russians do not have the capacity, in my view, to take over Ukraine. But obviously, if they were to do so, it would position Russian forces and all the developments inside of Ukraine right on right on NATO's doorstep as it relates to Poland and the Baltic states, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you've seen Poland and the Baltic states so engaged in Ukraine.
And can you talk a little bit about the economic impact that would mean, or that would have on the United States?
Well, I think, you've already seen that Russia's aggression, especially what they've done to limit the ability of grain to get to global markets through the Black Sea, has already had an impact on global security writ large. Obviously, the energy instability, which is generated by the war, has also had an economic consequence. So I think the war is already having significant consequences because of Russia's aggression, and had it been unchecked, I think those consequences would have been worse.
And we'd have been farther along. Thank you. With that time, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to express my gratitude, Mr. Chairman, to you and the ranking member for these ongoing conversations and this opportunity for us to provide oversight and for the American people to feel comfort, I hope and I believe, with the information that's being delivered. I'd like to thank our witnesses as well. I'd be remiss if I didn't remark on the incredible change that I've seen happen over the last 3 years since I attended the Munich Security Conference in 2019 versus the Munich Security Conference last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was. When I was there in 2019, there was a significant question about the West and whether the West would continue to support NATO, and just the fears about how untethered things seemed. But last week or the week before, whenever it was, sorry, time escapes me, but this year's Munich Security Conference, the incredible unity and the strength demonstrated by our allies and our friends, especially with regard to Ukraine and our defense of democracy. And I'm very proud of the role that the United States has played in rebuilding NATO and ensuring that the West has come together in a way to defend our friends and allies and help stop the Russian aggression. And I'd like to, Dr. Call, just in that vein, because there's been just such a lot of conversation, obviously, about the F-16s and about why the United States and some of our friends are not stepping up as quickly as some would like. My colleague, Representative Houlihan, she was about to ask a question, and I'd like to follow that up because I'm curious as well. But when her question, she started as her time ran out, when should the clock start on those F-16s? You know, you laid out for us very clearly and very effectively, you know, the considerations involved and also the financial implications as well. And that's on Congress, right, to make sure that we provide the continued support and to put our money where our mouth is. But when should that clock start ticking for the F-16s? And is that something you can discuss in this setting?
Look, I think it is, you know, a more modernized Ukrainian Air Force will be important in the medium and long term for Ukraine to continue to defend the territory that it claws back and to deter Russia in the future. So I think there is a medium to long term requirement. The challenge, of course, is even if it was a short term requirement, we couldn't get it to them immediately anyway, and we don't assess that it is the highest short term priority. And by the way, neither do the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians' priorities are air defense systems, so they're integrated air and missile defense systems, artillery and fires, armor and mechanized. And because every dollar you spend on one is a dollar you can't spend on another, there are real trade-offs. Obviously, Ukraine is going to continue having conversations with us. As I said, President Zelensky discussed this with President Biden in Kyiv last week. Zelensky has had similar conversations with our UK and French allies. The UK has announced an interest in starting to do some training, so we'll see where that leads. There are other countries in NATO, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, I think, that have talked about potentially F-16s that they may be offloading as they upgrade to F-35s. So I do think this conversation will continue. As I sit in the Pentagon, and I have to say, what does Ukraine need right now to stay in the fight and turn the tide against the Russians in the first half of this year, which I think is going to be decisive for the conflict? It's just hard for me to tell any member of Congress or the American people that the best use of that dollar spent right now is on F-16s.
Thank you so much, Dr. Call. And I only have a few seconds left, but I am wondering, in terms of the replenishment of U.S. stocks, is the department looking to utilize critical technologies such as additive manufacturing to fill some of those gaps?
Sorry. I think the short answer is yes, but I think it's probably better for us to arrange a briefing by our acquisitions and sustainment folks to really go through the kind of the multi-layered approach that they're taking to this, because they're the real experts on that.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, our aid packages to Ukraine have included light tactical vehicles like Humvees. I've been a staunch supporter of the Humvee upgrade. You know, when we had to retrofit the Humvees because of the risk of IEDs, of course, that made it top-heavy, but we have the ABS and the ESC rollover kits that prevent that. You know, we've lost too many men and women to rollovers, and a lot have been injured as well. So at the beginning of this fiscal year, approximately 40,000 Humvees that are either new or like new were in our fleet, hadn't received the anti-rollover technology. And my question for the witnesses is, when we're sending Humvees to the Ukraine, and where are they coming from? And more to the point, are we sending Humvees that have already been fully upgraded with the anti-rollover technology? Or are we sending Humvees that are slated to get this upgrade? Or are they coming from the demilitarized vehicle stockpile?
I might ask General Sims if I don't actually know the answer to that question, but DA may, or we may have to take it to come back to you.
Sure, I will have to come back to you. We'll bring that answer back to you. I'm not quite sure.
Okay, because we have Red River Army Depot that does a lot of this work, and they're starving at the vine, and we've got 40,000 units that need this upgrade, and I'd really like to get that in, because it saves about $12 billion rather than buying brand new ones to retrofit the ones we already have. So we want to always be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. So for the witnesses as well, one of the initiatives we've been working on in our office with our colleague, our friend from California, Mr. Panetta, is our Ukraine Human Rights Policy Act, and this legislation would take concrete steps to hold Russia accountable for their atrocities that they're committing in Ukraine. So what evidence of war crimes have you seen in Ukraine, including any committed by the Wagner Group? And as the war rages into its second year, what can be done to hold Russia accountable for their actions? And then what can be done during reconstruction?
I think our colleagues at the State Department would probably be better at cataloging all of the horrors, but we've all seen it. There's been a systematic targeting of civilians in Ukraine, clearly a callous disregard for civilian welfare. But this winter, the targeting of critical infrastructure, literally intending to starve and freeze tens of millions of people for no military purpose other than to try to compel the Ukrainians to give up. But certainly in violation of the laws of armed conflict. We've seen Russian troops engage in terrible atrocities, killing civilians, killing detained forces. And of course, we've also seen the deportation of Ukrainian children back to Russia, which is among the most heinous of war crimes.
Doctor, how many are we talking, you think, roughly?
Thousands, but beyond that, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I would encourage you to get a brief from the State Department. They have cataloged all of that.
General, as far as the Wagner Group goes, do you know any more specifics on that? Could you shed some light?
Sure, I don't. Again, as Dr. Call said, I think the State Department could answer that better. But as you and the rest of the country have seen, we're certainly concerned with what we see reported in the news. And just as, and I don't mean to segue, sir, but there was a comment earlier about about Russian atrocities or Russian acts. I think what separates our military, what separates Western military, certainly from the Russians, is our concentration on treating people, the way they should be treated, with dignity, on the laws of armed conflict that Dr. Call mentioned. And I know that we work hard to talk to the Ukrainians about the same things.
Is Russia a signature, General? Do you know? Is it a signature to the Geneva Convention?
Sir, that's a great question.
Just kind of thought about that. I don't know.
So they are. And even if they weren't, the Geneva Conventions are treated as customary international law, and so binding even on states that don't sign up to them.
In general, is it your professional opinion that the Wagner Group is something you'd be more concerned about because they're not Russian military regulars?
So I think the Wagner Group is given plenty of reason to be concerned. I mean, the fact that they're recruiting members from prisons certainly gives an indication of what kind of character that they're willing to recruit.
General, they say they're not doing that anymore.
Yes, sir.
Should we believe them?
Sir, I'm not sure I would trust the words that are coming from the Russian side right now.
So you're saying, in effect, that authoritarian regimes should not be taken at their word, regardless of whether it's, say, in Beijing or in Moscow?
Sir, I'd agree that we have a system in which I would trust, and they don't have that same.
I hope all members of Congress just heard you. Thank you. I yield back.
Jim's time started. Before we go to the next questioner, I want to remind everybody that we have a hard stop at 12:30 to go to the classified portion of this hearing. Gentleman from Maine, Mr. Golden's recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start by looking back to May of last year and point out that a bipartisan group of members of Congress, including members of this committee, have sent the administration letters, and that's gone on since April of last year all the way right up to right now, calling for the supply of advanced military capabilities to Ukraine quite consistently. So 10 months ago, a number of us called for anti-ship missiles, HIMARS, Abrams tanks, as well as training on and transfer of F-16s. About 5 months ago, once again, bipartisan group of members of this committee called for a long-term defense commitment to Ukraine to include surface-to-air missiles, MLRS, anti-ship missiles, howitzers, and again, training on and transfer of advanced aircraft such as the F-16. Now, in my opinion, these letters represent differing opinions, policy opinions, about the speed at which the United States should seek to deliver advanced fighting capabilities to the battlefield in Ukraine. Now, I really appreciate the conversation that's been going on, just thinking about things such as F-16 or ATACMS or previously Abrams or HIMARS. I think what we have seen is that there are sometimes policy questions and debates and differing opinions. Then there are logistical challenges, maintenance, and the training and capabilities of the Ukrainian fighters themselves, different than policy opinions of a differing nature. And of course, I respect the opinion brought forward by Dr. Carl about authorizations, appropriations, and how do we get the greatest ROI on the money that you have in hand right now to meet the top priorities of the Ukrainian military. But certainly, given enough money, they would prefer to have their top 5 or top 6 or top 10 needs or capabilities met. And the conversation about authorizations and appropriations is really, I think, a question for Congress, as opposed to questions of policy or logistical concerns and challenges. Now, of course, over the weekend, the President's national security team said now's not the right phase of the war for providing Ukraine advanced aircraft. That sounds like a policy decision. And they have also pointed out that the assessment of military commanders advising the President is that we need to focus on tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles and such. I don't think anyone disagrees with that, sir. And you've articulated really that this is about how much money do we have now, what's the greatest need that they have. But Ukraine has articulated a desire to advance their long-range fighting capabilities in the form of ATACMS and F-16s. So just about over a week ago, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, U.S. European Command, briefed members of Congress, Senate and House reportedly, and said that he believed we should send aircraft, drones, ATACMS to enhance the deep fight capabilities of the Ukrainian military. Setting aside all the concerns about logistics or maintenance or the readiness of the Ukrainian military, General Sims, would you agree with his assessment that this would help Ukraine to win the war ultimately?
Sir, I have no doubt that the continued provision of advanced conventional weapons would help Ukraine on the battlefield, no doubt. And I certainly have been extraordinarily impressed, as most have, with General Cavoli's work in Europe. On this side of the Atlantic, the conversation continues to be around certainly about policy decisions, but
sure.
In our conversations with the Ukrainians, as recent as yesterday with General Zaluzhny and the chairman, we do hold fast to the view that what they need right now are the things in front of them. That F-16s, as an example, would not help them today, but things like air defense, artillery, fighting vehicles, tanks is what we need to ensure we're providing.
So you don't agree with the EUCOM commander that possession of F-16s and ATACMS and other long-range capabilities would help them to win the war?
No, sir. I think that advanced conventional weapons would help anybody win a war.
Absolutely.
Yes,
is there a policy objection to giving them longer-range fires at this time?
So I think both the F-16s and the ATACMS issues, I think, are slightly different animals
in general. Is there a policy objection?
No, because the F-16s issue is less about a long-range capability. I think there is a general recognition that it will make sense for them over time to transition to fourth-generation aircraft. So it's more about the trade-offs. The ATACMS
just a few more seconds, but just with that, I would just point out, why not expand this conversation beyond the near term and the limits of the dollars that you have in your possession now and come to Congress with a plan that includes near-term, medium-term, and long-term, given that whether they win the war now or it drags on for several more years, the Russian threat will still remain. So I just think we got to expand the conversation.
Happy to brief you on that, and frankly, if you come to the classified session, we can also provide some more details on, because we have done some analysis on kind of the future Ukrainian force and what that might look like.
Thank you, gentleman's time has expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from South Carolina, Ms. Mace, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Smith, for hosting this very important hearing. I want to thank the gentlemen who are here today, as well to take all of our very important questions. We're here to address a critical matter of national security and foreign policy in regards to Ukraine, the need for oversight of assets, weapons, munitions, and other aid, lethal aid being provided to Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has highlighted the critical need for rapid aid and support that we're providing to that region. The conflict has resulted in heavy losses for both sides, but we've seen the Ukrainian forces, they've demonstrated their resilience and ability to conduct offensive operations, I believe, over the last year to everyone's surprise. There's no price for resiliency and their belief in their freedom and their fight for freedom. They've been on the world stage, I think have encouraged and inspired many folks around the world. However, their capacity to defend their sovereignty and security is dependent on receiving timely and effective assistance. In particular, we've seen a troubling pattern of delays and bureaucratic hurdles, policy decisions that have slowed the delivery of aid to Ukraine. I've witnessed this firsthand. I've witnessed the State Department slow rolling in some cases, particularly at the beginning of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. And it's my belief in the meetings I've had, both publicly and privately, and in the SCIF, that Ukraine just doesn't have a lot of time. And we want to make sure that our investment in their fight, that they're going to win. It's more important than ever seeing what Russia's trying to do. They want to now take away Poland's borders and other countries. Ukraine can't lose this fight, in my estimation. The situation in Ukraine demands urgent action, a commitment to ensuring the lethal aid and support be provided expeditiously. Congress and DoD need to take the steps to remove any hurdles or address them to ensure the necessary resources are available to fight for Ukraine to fight for its sovereignty and security. Failure to do so would not only endanger Ukraine, but also undermine global stability, global security. And it's my estimation Ukraine is just, I believe, under the gun and just does not have very much time left in this endeavor. My first question is for Undersecretary Call. I'm concerned about the time it took for the U.S. to fully leverage some of our existing processes, like convening the Senior Integration Group for Ukraine, SIG Ukraine, to disperse military aid to Ukraine. And thinking ahead, China and Taiwan, we all know that China is watching. Are there any specific improvements you would make to the department's decision-making process to ensure the U.S. is proactively readying this important partner rather than simply reacting with support? Some of the lessons learned, how long did it take to stand up SIG Ukraine? Some of what you learned over the last year in this process.
Thank you for that, and I'll just say we share your sense of urgency. And there's always going to be red tape, but we have blasted through a lot of it. And if you had, I think, told us a year ago that we could have executed on $31.7 billion in security assistance to anybody, I would have said that was bureaucratically impossible. And it's precisely because we tried to blast through as much red tape as possible. Most of that assistance has come through PDA, Presidential Drawdown Authority, and typically because we pre-position things and get our ducks in a row, a lot of that equipment starts flowing in within days of the president signing the PDA, and Lieutenant General Sims can talk to you more about that. In terms of our internal processes, we have two. We have something called the Cross-Department Working Group, which is essentially the group that my office runs, but it's got stakeholders from all the services, the Joint Staff, the combatant commands, et cetera, to rack and stack Ukrainian priorities and figure out the priorities for various PDA and USAI packages. So that's really about kind of teeing up for the Secretary. Ultimately, there's recommendations that then go over to the White House. We then have the SIG process, which you
How long did it take to stand up the SIG?
You know, I'd have to get back to you on the exact date. I think the SIG was stood up within a couple of months of the.
Is that fast enough, in your opinion?
Well, I think that we've stood up a lot of processes that are new.
Do you think that Taiwan has a couple of months?
We already have a SIG for Taiwan. So to your point,
stood up and ready to go. So it's all.
It meets monthly, chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Defense.
Excellent. And then on the working group, their cross-department working group. Is that working better now than it has been before because of the urgency of Ukraine? Have you all learned over the last year how to improve some of the red tape, I guess? What red tape was removed to make it work better, faster, more in this case?
Well, just traditionally, we've not Presidential Drawdown Authority has been used to provide things in the amounts of, hundreds of billions of dollars at the upper end, not tens of billions of dollars. So there was a lot of learning curve. Essentially, what we figured out was to make sure all the stakeholders were involved. You had an iterated process that culminates in a 4-star meeting that I chair about every 10 days, and then that pushes recommendations up to the chairman and the secretary, who then push those recommendations over to the White House.
Time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jackson, for 5 minutes.
General Sims, good afternoon. I was wondering if you could help me paint a picture for my folks back home of what life would look like for Ukrainians were we to step aside, were we to withdraw our support, were the coalition that we lead to crumble upon our withdrawal of our support, and then were the Russians to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield. What that would mean, and I ask you because based on your remarks, you said that the fighting has replicated the conditions that we saw during the First World War. There was a recent conversation about plentiful examples of war crimes that have been committed. And I think it's important for me in explaining my support to folks back home to give them a sense of what it would look like if our effort no longer existed. Could you help me do that, please?
So, sir, I'll leave the geopolitical conversation to what Dr. Call was mentioning earlier. And I would tell you a couple things. First would be, as an American, this is what we do. I mean, this is what we do. This is what we've fundamentally done for decades. When people are wronged, we stand up for them. And in this case, the invasion of Russia, everyone has said it was illegal. Everybody says it was wrong. And that's what we do. And in this case, we came together with the allies in Europe in a way that we haven't done, really haven't done in the past 50, 60 years. I mean, so a year ago today, so we talk about a year ago on the 24th was the invasion. A year ago today, I deployed with my division headquarters as a division commander, 1st ID, to Central Europe. And I spent a lot of time in Europe, battalion commander, brigade commander. And so I've worked a number of times with our allies. I had never worked with our allies where the desire, the intent to work together was as firm as it was in the time I was deployed. That has not changed. I've been back multiple times. We were talking earlier about the contributions of our partners. There is more than dollars, I would argue, that is part of this. We have partners that have skin in the game, and so they may not be dedicated dedicating the same percentage of GDP, but in some cases are dedicating individuals who are making critical, really important contributions to what we're doing in terms of security assistance, intelligence, working in terms of advising and training with our partners. That's what we do. We're Americans, and when somebody says this is how the world should be, and it's not, we say no. Dr. Cause talked about the rules-based order. Why is this important? Because after the Second World War, we came together with the majority of the world and said, this last 5-10 years is not how we wish to live in the world. And we established the geopolitics that exist today. And we need to tell people, we need to do something when people go in the wrong direction. Why is it important to Americans? Because we believe in this group in here, sir, in this oversight process. I know politics. I'm an Army guy. No politics. American politics field of study at the Academy. And I would tell you, watching the oversight here, watching what has occurred in D.C., all the way to the young man or woman in Poland who's transitioning that equipment forward, to a Ukrainian who plans to use it, that's what we exist for. That's why it matters, sir.
Now, that last piece I'd like you to expand on. Could you help us visualize what it looks like when we make the decision to send them light tactical vehicles all the way to that material being fielded? Give us a sense of what that process looks like, how quickly it's now moving.
Well, sir, and as Dr. Call was talking with Representative Mace earlier, we're learning all sorts of lessons. I mean, listen, where we were a year ago today and where we are now, it's a light year's difference. It's because we have smart, capable men and women who are working to make the processes more effective and efficient. What we have done in terms of moving, it's literally, I'll say literally moving mountains. If you were to stack up all of the things that we have provided, we have literally moved mountains from not just the United States, but from places that we're working with partners around the world. And we have moved that incrementally across oceans, in the air, with hundreds and hundreds of aircraft and ships. Move that to Europe, and then it's moved further by our partners and by men and women that we all are so proud to have there, all the way to a point where a Ukrainian man or woman takes it and brings it forward to use it. And I know a number of you have seen that, sir, but it's pretty impressive.
My time is over. It has been an extraordinary logistical accomplishment on top of other accomplishments.
Sure.
Chair now recognizes our final questioner before we go into classified brief, and that's the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lieutenant General Sims, to what degree do the operational plans within DoD rely upon the assumption that we would be only forced to defeat an adversary in one theater and deter an adversary in another theater?
Well, sir, not to jump into the policy side, but I mean, that's what we're saying we're doing. Yes, sir.
So given the growing no-limits security partnership between Beijing and Moscow in the years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, can we reasonably argue that planning for a confrontation with only one adversary is becoming an increasingly dangerous presumption?
Sir, I'd argue that the fact that the Chinese and the Russians are having conversations about ways that they can improve their connections is dangerous to all of us as Americans. But I think that the current work that we're doing takes into account where we are around the world.
If Xi Jinping makes the foolish decision of arming Russia with weapons, what is on the table in terms of our response?
Sir, that one I'll definitely leave to Dr. Call.
Okay, Dr. Call. You can make news here.
So first of all, I don't think China's leadership wants their intentions and plans to be made public. So one of the things we've made clear to them is if we have information that they're doing this, we'll make it public. And this actually, it matters because, as you know, China's on a bit of a charm offensive to get back into the good graces of Europe. That's not going to work, I don't think, period, but certainly not if they're providing large amounts of lethal assistance to Russia. We've also signaled Secretary Blinken with his counterpart at the Munich Security Conference and through other channels that there would be significant costs. I'm happy in the classified session to talk about what some of that might look like, but it would be the similar tools we've used to impose on others that have violated U.S. sanctions.
So we are actively trying to deter the CCP from providing lethal assistance to Russia.
Yes.
And of course, at a broader level, we are actively trying to deter the CCP from invading Taiwan by force, if necessary. Yes. I think this is a perfect example. And I know you've talked, well, I just came back from 4 days in Taiwan, and I was struck by the all the national security leaders there talked about this increasing strategic convergence between Russia and China. I'm curious if you see it in the same way. It's sort of my contention that increasingly Putin is Xi's junior partner in a de facto alliance against the West, and I think we initially understood the No Limits partnership to be a piece of paper, and increasingly it's something real, but I'd love to get your comment on how you see these two problem sets as connected.
Yeah, I think that's insightful and on the money. I think basically, you know, Russia for a long time has not wanted to be China's junior partner. And I think that held alive the dream in Washington that you could drive a wedge between these two actors. I think the war in Ukraine has essentially ended that proposition as realistic in the foreseeable future because Russia's going to have to turn to China for technology, for economic assistance, to help them reconstitute their military after the war. And they're already turning to them now. But by the way, the same calculus is driving the Russians, to have greater convergence with Iran and North Korea as well. And so I do think because of how attrited the Russian military has been, they have no choice but to you know, move closer to some of these other actors.
Now, you've said recently, I believe, though, that you don't see a PLA invasion of Taiwan as imminent within the next 2 years.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just see no indications that Xi Jinping thinks his military is ready or that the PLA thinks they're ready. I think he has put a date on the dartboard for them to be ready. That doesn't mean they have made the decision to do it, and that's 2027. I think in the interim period, I do not see indications that they are likely to make a leap to invade the island of Taiwan.
But just so I understand, your assessment is based on the absence of evidence that you don't see an indication that they're getting ready to invade. I guess maybe
actually, this would be a really interesting thread of the conversation for us to talk about in the classified setting.
Got it.
Because it's not just about that.
Interesting. Just out of curiosity, did you view, 2 years ago, did you view a Russian invasion of the rest of Ukraine as imminent?
As imminent, I did not. But of course, we had indications and warnings first in April and then, of course, in the fall that it was a possibility. And, you know, my assessment is based on the information and intelligence that I have at the moment. If information and intelligence change, then my assessment will be updated.
And so you disagree, I'm out of time, with General Minahan's recent assessment that 2025 is the danger zone?
I do.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. We will start questioning in the classified portion with those members who haven't been recognized for questions in the public portion. So right now we stand in recess for 5 minutes as we move to 2212 for the classified portion of this hearing.